On a quiet October evening in 2011, paramedics rushed to a home in Scarborough, a peaceful suburban neighborhood in Toronto, Canada. Inside that home, they found a young woman lying completely motionless in her bathtub. The bath water surrounding her body hadn't been drained. Her husband stood nearby, visibly shaken, claiming he had just returned from an evening jog through the neighborhood, to find her unresponsive in the water. She was 29 years old. She was 20 weeks pregnant with their child, and she would never take another breath. Her name was Carissa Grandin, though everyone who knew and loved her simply called her Carissa. And this is her story. For the darkest stories Britain has to offer, introducing our new book, The Crime Stories, British Edition, 35 shocking true murder cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And now let's continue with today's case. Carissa Grandin grew up in a close-knit community, centered entirely around faith and family. From her earliest years, she was deeply embedded in her church family, surrounded by people who watched her grow from an innocent child into a young woman with hopes, dreams, and aspirations for the future. One community leader would later tell reporters that he had known Carissa since she was a child. She wasn't merely a congregation member who showed up on Sundays. She was someone the entire community had helped raise, someone they genuinely cared about, someone whose bright presence consistently lifted the spirits of those around her. Her mother, Cherito Darwin, also known as Maria, was a devoted and loving parent who maintained an incredibly close relationship with her daughter throughout her entire life. Her father lived thousands of miles away in the Philippines, separated by an ocean, but he remained deeply connected to Carissa through regular phone calls, heartfelt letters, and the occasional precious visit whenever circumstances allowed. Despite the vast geographical distance between them, the bond between father and daughter remained unbreakably strong, built on a foundation of love that transcended borders. As Carissa matured into adulthood, she carried with her all the values that had been carefully instilled during her upbringing: unwavering faith in God, deep commitment to family, trust in her community, and boundless hope for the future. By her late 20s, she had built what appeared to be a beautiful and fulfilling life, one that seemed to contain everything she had ever hoped for. She was married to Philip Grandin, a man who presented himself to the world as a devoted servant of God and a pillar of moral righteousness within their close-knit community. Philip worked as a part-time pastor at Ennerdale Baptist Church in Toronto, a position that carried enormous trust and moral responsibility. He was the person congregation members turned to during their darkest and most difficult hours, the voice guiding them through challenging decisions, the moral compass pointing toward righteous living. He stood at the pulpit on Sundays, delivering passionate sermons about faith, commitment, honesty, and the importance of living according to God's sacred teachings. For Carissa, marrying a pastor must have seemed like an extraordinary blessing from above, a husband who had dedicated his entire life to serving God, to helping others navigate their spiritual journeys, to living with unwavering integrity and moral purpose. In her eyes, she had found a partner who shared her deepest values and beliefs, someone she could trust completely and without reservation, someone who would protect and cherish her for the rest of their lives together. But behind the closed doors of their Scarborough home, hidden from the congregation and the community that trusted him implicitly, a very different and far darker reality was beginning to take shape, one that would ultimately cost Carissa everything she had. At some point during their marriage, Philip Grandin began constructing a secret life that contradicted everything he publicly claimed to believe. While he delivered sermons about morality, fidelity, and the sacred bonds of marriage, he was engaged in an extramarital affair with a woman connected to his own church, a parishioner who likely sat in the pews listening to his sermons about righteousness. While he counseled couples about honesty and trust, he was consuming pornography in secret, indulging in the behaviors he publicly condemned from the pulpit. Philip Grandin was living two completely separate lives, maintaining a facade of piety while engaging in profound hypocrisy. Eventually, the affair came to light. The discovery must have been devastating for Carissa. The pastor she had married, believing he embodied sacred values, had been betraying her in the most intimate way possible. The consequences appeared severe. Philip stepped down from his pastoral duties, a public acknowledgement of his moral failings. The couple entered marriage counseling, attempting to repair what had been broken. Clear conditions were established for reconciliation. Philip had to end the affair permanently. He had to stop consuming pornography. A porn blocking program was installed on their computer. From the outside, it might have appeared the Grandins were working through a difficult period. Carissa, believing in the redemptive power of forgiveness, gave her husband another chance. By October 2011, there was reason for optimism. Carissa was pregnant, 20 weeks along, safely past the most dangerous period of early pregnancy. She was carrying their child, a new life representing the possibility of healing and moving forward. But Philip Grandin had never truly changed. The affair had never actually ended. He had simply become more careful about hiding it. The pornography continued despite the blocking software. The conditions of reconciliation were nothing more than another layer of deception. According to evidence that would later emerge in court, Philip viewed his pregnant wife not as a blessing, but as an obstacle, a barrier between him and the double life he truly wanted. The prosecution would later argue that as Carissa's pregnancy progressed, Philip began formulating a plan to remove that obstacle permanently. Philip Grandin's second job provided him with exactly the means he needed. In addition to his pastoral work, Philip was employed as a nurse manager at a nursing home. This position gave him regular, unsupervised access to controlled medications, including benzodiazepines, powerful sedative drugs. One such medication was lorazepam, better known as Ativan. Lorazepam can cause significant drowsiness, mental confusion, impaired coordination, and memory problems. When combined with factors like warm bathwater and physical exhaustion, the effects can become dangerous, even fatal. Carissa Grandin had never been prescribed lorazepam. There was no innocent explanation for why it would be in her body, yet approximately 3 days before her death, around October 14, 2011, something concerning happened. Carissa went to the hospital with troubling symptoms, unexplained sleepiness, confusion, and disorientation. Physicians took blood samples, but with no reason to suspect anything sinister, didn't test for sedatives. Carissa was examined, monitored, and sent home when her condition stabilized. 3 days later, she would be dead. It was only after her death that those hospital blood samples were tested for additional substances. The results sent shockwaves through the investigation. Lorazepam was present 3 full days before she drowned. This wasn't an isolated incident. According to findings later established by Justice Faye McWatt, Philip Grandin had administered lorazepam to his wife on multiple occasions without her knowledge. The hospital visit wasn't the beginning of something sinister. It was evidence of an ongoing pattern of secret sedation. The judge made a critical observation that demolished the defense's theory. If Carissa had knowingly taken lorazepam herself, she would not have been confused about her symptoms. She would have known she had taken a sedative. The fact that she arrived at the hospital bewildered and unable to explain her symptoms pointed to one conclusion. Someone was drugging her without her knowledge. That someone had access to lorazepam through his job. That someone had motive. That someone was Philip Grandin. The evening of October 17, 2011 began much like any other evening in the Grandin household. There was nothing extraordinary to mark it as different. Nothing to suggest that unspeakable tragedy was mere hours away. But this night would be anything but ordinary. Before dawn broke the next morning, a young woman and her unborn child would both be dead. According to telephone records that investigators would later obtain and carefully analyze, Philip Grandin spent a significant portion of that fateful evening on the phone with his mistress, the same woman the affair was supposed to have ended with months earlier during marriage counseling. The same forbidden relationship that the counseling sessions were specifically designed to repair. The same secret Philip had solemnly promised to abandon forever. Whatever sacred vows he had made, whatever heartfelt commitments he had offered to save his marriage, they had clearly been utterly meaningless from the very start. At some point during the evening, Carissa decided to take a bath. She was 20 weeks pregnant, likely experiencing the physical exhaustion and bodily discomfort common to the second trimester of pregnancy. A warm, relaxing bath would have seemed like a perfectly normal, reasonable way for a tired pregnant woman to unwind at the end of a long day. But Carissa was not in her normal physical or mental state that evening. Once again, lorazepam was coursing through her system. A powerful sedative she had never been prescribed by any physician. A drug she had absolutely no legitimate access to. Crown Prosecutor Donna Kelway would later paint a damning picture of exactly what Philip Grandin had done that night. She described his calculated actions in vivid, unforgettable terms. He was playing Russian roulette with her chances of having some kind of so-called accident. The image is chilling in its accuracy. Philip didn't need to physically hold Carissa's head underwater. He didn't need to leave any visible marks of violence on her body. He simply needed to render her helpless and place her in a situation where tragedy could unfold naturally, where an accident could occur that would conveniently free him from his marriage and all his unwanted responsibilities. What actually happened in that bathroom during the final moments of Carissa's life remains known only to Philip Grandin himself. No witnesses were present. No surveillance cameras captured the scene. But at some point during that evening, Carissa Grandin, sedated and significantly impaired by a drug her own husband had secretly administered, 20 weeks pregnant with their child, slipped beneath the surface of the warm bath water and never came back up. When paramedics arrived at the Scarborough home in response to Philip's 911 call, they found a scene that immediately raised serious questions. Carissa was still lying in the bathtub exactly where she had drowned. The water surrounding her body had not been drained. A husband who claimed to have discovered his wife drowning and desperately tried to save her hadn't even bothered to empty the tub as part of his supposed rescue efforts. Despite the best efforts of the emergency medical team, Anna Carissa Grandin could not be revived. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Her unborn child, the baby she had been carrying for 20 weeks, the life she had been nurturing and dreaming about, died with her that night. Philip Grandin told the responding authorities a carefully crafted story designed to establish his innocence. He claimed he had been out jogging through the neighborhood that evening. He said he returned home from his run only to discover his wife unconscious and unresponsive in the bathtub. The investigators listened carefully to every word of his account. They noted all the details he provided. They closely observed his demeanor, and they didn't believe a single word of it. In the weeks following Carissa's death, the investigation gathered evidence that would systematically dismantle Philip's narrative. The autopsy confirmed Carissa had drowned, but toxicology raised red flags. Lorazepam was present, a drug she had never been prescribed. Investigators retrieved the blood samples from her hospital visit 3 days earlier. Lorazepam was there too. This was a pattern of sedation, not a single incident. Philip had access to lorazepam through his nursing home job. He had motive, the affair, the double life, the pregnancy binding him to a marriage he wanted to escape. Digital evidence added another damning layer. Investigators discovered computer searches related to lorazepam. Even more disturbing, they found searches for autopsy, suggesting Philip had researched what would happen to Carissa's body after death. Philip's alibi collapsed. Evidence showed he had been home, not jogging. Phone records revealed what he was doing while his wife lay dying, talking to his mistress. 6 months after Carissa's death, Philip Grandin was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Philip Grandin's first trial began in November 2014. The prosecution presented evidence of sedation, deception, and motive. The defense argued Carissa was depressed, had obtained lorazepam herself, and that her death was accident or suicide. On December 4, 2014, the jury delivered their verdict. They rejected first-degree murder, but also rejected the defense's theory. The verdict, guilty of manslaughter. The jury concluded Philip's reckless actions had caused his wife's death. He had created the dangerous conditions leading to her drowning. In January 2015, Philip was sentenced to approximately 15 years in prison. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But Philip wasn't finished. His legal team began preparing an appeal. On September 15, 2017, Philip received news that would force Carissa's family to relive their nightmare. The Ontario Court of Appeal granted a new trial. The appeals court found issues with how certain evidence had been presented. Legal technicalities had created grounds for overturning the verdict. For Carissa's loved ones, the news was devastating. They had endured one trial. Now they would do it all over again. Family friend Cliff McDowell spoke to reporters. It's going to be difficult and stressful. The second trial began February 1st, 2019, more than 7 years after Carissa's death. Crown Prosecutor Donna Kelway laid out the evidence of Philip's double life, his access to sedatives, and his lies. He was playing Russian roulette with her chances of having some kind of so-called accident, she told the jury. The defense continued arguing Carissa took lorazepam voluntarily, but the argument was increasingly difficult to sustain. On February 28, 2019, the jury returned their verdict, guilty of manslaughter. For the second time, Philip Grandin was found criminally responsible for his wife's death. The sentencing hearing in May 2019 finally gave Carissa's family a chance to speak. Her mother, Carissa Darwin, addressed the court. "There must be a just punishment for this heinous act, as my daughter cries out for justice from her grave." Carissa's father had his statement read aloud. He described the journey to Toronto to bury his daughter. "I was so grieved and heartbroken on the way there that I became so dizzy and almost passed out." Deacon Robert Steve spoke to the community's pain. "This has stolen my trust and faith in people." In November 2019, Justice Faye McWhat delivered her findings. She found Philip had researched and obtained lorazepam from his workplace. He had administered it to his wife without her knowledge. He had lied to police about his whereabouts. He had lied about his rescue attempts. Regarding those claimed rescue efforts, the judge was blunt. Had he truly intended to get his wife out of the bath, he would have been able to do so. She called his actions a pretense and a charade. On January 7, 2020, Justice McWhat sentenced Philip to 15 years imprisonment. But 3 days later, another twist emerged. An Ontario Court of Appeal justice granted Philip bail pending his appeal. Justice Benjamin Zarnett noted, "There is a ground of appeal that clearly surpasses the not frivolous standard." Philip Grandin walked out of prison, while Carissa remained in her grave. The appeal was heard in 2022. Philip's attorneys argued there were problems with jury instructions and how computer evidence was admitted. On May 9, 2022, the Court of Appeal delivered its decision. Philip Grandin's appeal was dismissed. The court found no merit to his arguments and no basis to interfere with the conviction. Regarding the 15-year sentence, they called it fit and reasonable. Nearly 11 years after Carissa's death, after 2 trials and multiple appeals, the Canadian justice system delivered its final verdict. Anna Carissa Grandin should be alive today. She should have celebrated many more birthdays by now. Her child would be 13 years old enough to be starting middle school, developing their own unique personality, making friends, discovering their passions, building their own dreams for the future ahead. Instead, there are only memories, faded photographs, and a grief that will never fully heal. Carissa placed her complete trust in the person she should have been safest with, her husband, a pastor. A man who publicly dedicated his entire life to serving God and guiding others toward moral living. She trusted him enough to forgive his betrayal when she discovered the affair. She trusted him enough to try saving their marriage through counseling. She trusted him enough to believe his promises that he would change. She trusted him enough to carry his child inside her body. That sacred trust was weaponized against her in the cruelest and most devastating possible way. Philip didn't use violence in the traditional sense. He didn't leave marks or bruises that would immediately draw suspicion. Instead, he used his professional medical knowledge, his easy access to controlled medications through his nursing home job, and his wife's fundamental trust in him to create a situation where she would simply disappear from his life, where a convenient accident would free him to pursue the double life he valued more than his marriage vows, more than his pregnant wife, more than the child she was carrying. The prosecution called it Russian roulette with his wife's life. The judge called it a pretense and a charade. Carissa's grieving mother called it a heinous act that cries out for justice from the grave. Whatever words we use to describe what Philip Grandin did, we must remember one fundamental truth. A young woman lost her life because the person who stood before God and swore to love, honor, and protect her chose instead to betray her in the most final and irreversible way imaginable. Carissa Grandin deserves so much better than the fate she received. Her child, that innocent baby who never got to take a first breath, never got to see the world, never got to be held by grandparents who would have loved them unconditionally, deserved a chance at life. For Charito Darwin, there will always be an empty chair at family gatherings, always a birthday that passes with tears instead of celebration, always that moment of forgetting followed by crushing remembrance. For Carissa's father in the Philippines, there will always be the haunting memory of that devastating flight to Toronto. The physical manifestation of grief, so profound it nearly knocked him unconscious. Some crimes leave wounds that time cannot fully heal. Some crimes remind us with terrible clarity that the people we trust most completely can sometimes be the most dangerous. Some crimes teach us the hardest lesson of all, that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears a pastor's collar, speaks in gentle and comforting tones, and waits patiently for the right moment to strike. This was one of those crimes. Rest in peace, Carissa. Rest in peace, little one. You will not be forgotten. Story 1. Imagine loving someone so much that you leave your own family behind for them, only to end up dead, chopped up, and stuffed in a drum. If you think this kind of nightmare only happens in movies, well, it was very real for Sarah Barragepit. And when people in Merritt found out what had happened, They were so furious that they literally stormed the police station when the suspects were caught. But what could have led to something this dark? What secrets were buried in Sarabar's past? And who were the people twisted enough to turn love into a nightmare? Before we unpack the horrifying truth, let's rewind and meet the people at the center of this chilling mystery. This is Muskan Rastogi, a young woman in her early 20s, often described as beautiful, confident, and charming. She had that kind of presence that drew people in without even trying. Her story became intertwined with that of a man named Sarah Barajput, a 35-year-old former Merchant Navy officer, whose life took a tragic turn all because he fell in love with the wrong person. Saraba was a man who had already lived through a lot. He came from a well-to-do family and had served in the Merchant Navy, which meant he had traveled the world, experienced different cultures, and worked hard for his future. But when he met Muskan back in the year 2016, everything changed. He was drawn to her almost instantly. Maybe it was her youth, her beauty, or the way she made him feel alive again. Despite their 10-year age gap, love blossomed between them, or at least that's what Saraba believed. Now if there's one thing to keep in mind, it's that their relationship wasn't smooth from the start. Saraba's family didn't approve of Muskan. Whether it was the age difference or something deeper, his parents strongly opposed the relationship. But love can be blind, and Saraba chose Muskan over his own family. He cut ties with them and married her anyway. They moved into a modest rented flat in Merritt, determined to build a new life together, no matter the cost. 3 years into their marriage, in 2019, they welcomed a baby girl. Saraba was now a father, and although he was estranged from his own family, he was determined to create a happy home. He shifted from his career in the Merchant Navy to a more stable job to spend more time with his wife and daughter. But what he didn't know was that Muskan's feelings had started to change. The passion that once sparked between them was slowly fading, for her at least. That same year, Muskan joined a school alumni WhatsApp group. It was through that group that she reconnected with an old childhood friend, Sahil Shukla. At first it was innocent, just some catching up, reminiscing about school days. But very quickly, it turned into something more. They began meeting up, spending more and more time together, and eventually started an affair. They also started doing drugs together, which only pulled them deeper into a toxic world of secrets, addiction, and obsession. When Saraba discovered the truth about Muskan's affair with Sahil, it shattered him. The betrayal cut deep, and he even went as far as consulting a lawyer, preparing to file for divorce. This wasn't just a rumor. He confronted Muskan head-on in 2021, and it wasn't just him who knew. Their landlord had caught them in a compromising situation, adding salt to the wound. But despite the pain, when Saraba thought about his young daughter, his heart wavered. He couldn't bring himself to walk away. Maybe just maybe he thought Muskan would return to him, that the they once shared would reignite. In 2023, Saraba accepted a job in London. He hoped the distance might cool things down, maybe give Muskan the space to rethink everything. What he didn't know was that in his absence, Muskan and Sahil's relationship grew even stronger and more dangerous. It was during this time that Muskan began manipulating Sahil in a chilling way. Knowing he was superstitious, she created fake Snapchat accounts, pretending to be dead relatives who claimed that Sahil and Muskan were meant to be together, and that Saraba had to die for their destiny to be fulfilled. By November of 2023, they had already started planning the murder. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was cold, calculated, and horrifying. But it wasn't until March 4th, 2025, that those plans began to take action, setting in motion a chain of events that would leave a family torn apart and an entire community reeling from the brutal truth of what had unfolded. Saraba, blissfully unaware, had come home that day with a plate of Laki Kukoft his mother had prepared. It was supposed to be a simple, peaceful meal, but it would become the first step in his unimaginable demise. Muskan, ever the schemer, had other plans. While the dish was still warm, she reheated it, and then laced the food with sedatives. The poisonous plan was in motion, and her husband's fate was sealed. Saraba began to feel the effects of the sedatives shortly after eating. His limbs grew heavy, his vision blurred, and his consciousness began to fade. As he slipped deeper into unconsciousness, Muskan didn't waste a second. She wasted no time in dialing Sahil, her lover and accomplice, urging him to come over. Sahil, who had been waiting for this moment, made his way to the house in the Indranagar area of Merritt. Together, they would carry out the horrific plan they had meticulously crafted over years. At first, they stabbed him, mercilessly and with full force. According to the post-mortem report, Sarabah was stabbed 3 times in the heart with such brutality that his heart was punctured, and excessive bleeding ensued. But this wasn't enough for Muskin and Sahil. To make sure Sarabah was truly silenced, they didn't stop at stabbing. In a truly macabre twist, they severed Sarabah's head and cut off his hands. His legs were contorted backwards, bent in ways they were never meant to go, in an apparent attempt to stuff the mangled body into a drum. The act was sickening. Sarabah's body was dismembered in the most horrifying way, a disturbing indication of how far Muskin and Sahil were willing to go to carry out their gruesome plot. But it didn't end there. After killing Sarabah, they weren't immediately satisfied. Their plan had one more sickening step. They shoved his dismembered body into a large drum, filling it with cement to conceal the crime. The drum was sealed tightly, ensuring that Sarabah's remains would stay hidden from prying eyes. It wasn't until March 18th, when police began investigating his disappearance, that his mutilated body was discovered, sealed under layers of concrete. The details of the crime spread like wildfire, and imagine the shock you'd feel if you were one of their neighbors. You'd be left in disbelief, trying to wrap your head around the horror that had unfolded. In cases like this, it doesn't take long for suspicions to fall on the one person who's mysteriously disappeared, the wife, who's off on a vacation just as everything unravels. It didn't take long for the authorities to zero in on Muskin and Sahil, especially when their strange behavior became too hard to ignore. On March 4th, just a day after Sarabah's murder, the two had been spotted together, showing no sign of guilt or remorse. It was as if they had already begun to move on from the brutal act they had just committed. But their calm demeanor wasn't to last. After Sarabah's body was disposed of, the two didn't flee in fear or hide away in shame. Instead, they decided to travel. They journeyed to Himachal Pradesh on March 10th, checking into a hotel in Kaisal under false identities. There, they celebrated Holi and indulged in lavish activities, living as though nothing had happened. They even danced at a nightclub, with videos surfacing later showing them enjoying their time in the midst of the horror they had just committed. But the cracks in their facades soon began to show. The hotel staff noticed their odd behavior. They rarely left their room, and seemed intent on isolating themselves from the rest of the guests. They instructed the staff not to clean their room and didn't engage in conversation with anyone. It was as though they wanted to ensure they left no trace behind. But as their funds dwindled, their perfect escape began to fall apart, and they were forced to return to Meerut on March 16th. By then, the police had already started putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Muskin and Sahil's behavior had raised suspicions, and their quick trip to Himachal Pradesh had only deepened the mystery. It wasn't long before they were tracked down and arrested. What makes this case so disturbingly chilling isn't just the murder itself, but the twisted manipulation that led to it. You'd think, perhaps, that Sahil was the one pulling the strings, using Muskin as a pawn, right? Well, think again. New and shocking details have surfaced, turning everything we thought we knew upside down. The disturbing truth reveals that it was Muskin, not Sahil, who orchestrated this crime in the most sinister way. New evidence has emerged, painting a picture of a woman so manipulative that it's hard to fathom. Muskin didn't just play a passive role, she took the lead in this horrific crime. According to sources, Muskin didn't simply convince Sahil to murder her husband. No, she took her manipulation to a whole new level, going as far as pretending to be Sahil's dead mother through Snapchat. That's right, Muskin, aware of Sahil's deep superstition and blind belief in black magic, used it against him. Muskin, knowing how vulnerable Sahil was to these supernatural beliefs, created multiple fake Snapchat accounts to deceive him. She used her brother's phone to set up these identities, including one account, pretending to be Sahil's deceased mother. The text messages sent from these accounts were chilling in their content. The ghostly voice of Sahil's mother, allegedly speaking from the afterlife, twisted the truth into a horrifying narrative. One message, under the alias of Sahil's dead mother, reads, "Raja, my child, forgive us. We won't come to speak to you again. Whatever happens now will happen. The divine force will protect you. She will sacrifice herself, but won't let anything happen to you." As if this wasn't disturbing enough, another message from the same mother claims, "Everything is ruined, my child. Take care of Jidya. Now even I won't return, Raja, my child." In the most twisted of all communications, Muskin, pretending to be Sahil's mother, wrote, "Raja, your wife has passed the test. She has become a part of our family. We are so happy with our daughter. Our ancestors have blessed her." This was no ordinary text. Muskin, speaking as Sahil's deceased mother, went on to tell him, She has become a Brahmin, and now no one can defeat my daughter-in-law. His death is destined at Muskin's hands. What's truly chilling here is that Muskin wasn't just manipulating Sahel emotionally. She was planting seeds of a twisted fate, convincing him that Sorab's death wasn't only inevitable but somehow divine. It's hard to imagine how far Muskin was willing to go to get rid of Sorab, but her actions show a terrifying level of cunning. Now, on the same day Muskin Rastogi and Sahel Shukla were arrested, the courtroom turned into a battlefield. As the two were brought before the chief judicial magistrate, a mob of furious lawyers launched a physical attack. Yes, lawyers. They tore Sahel's clothes, shouted curses, and chaos erupted until police were forced to intervene. Bail? Denied. The court wasn't having any of their drama. Both were slapped with 14 days of judicial custody. And just like that, the murderers of Sorab Rajput were officially put behind bars. Muskin was thrown into the women's barak, silent, starved and visibly shaken. Sahel and the men's barak didn't fare much better. Jail sources claim the duo even requested to be placed next to each other. Talk about delusional romance after a nightmare crime. Now, if you're wondering how the police ended up uncovering Shurab's mutilated body, well, Muskin had calmly told neighbors that she and Shurab were off to Himachal Pradesh for a peaceful vacation. No one suspected a thing. But days passed, and something sinister began to hang in the air. Literally. A nauseating stench started creeping through the Indira Nagar neighborhood, so foul it couldn't be ignored. That smell became the first clue in a nightmare. Concerned neighbors finally called the cops. And that's when everything unraveled. Inside the house, police found a large cement-sealed drum, Sorab's horrifying tomb. According to the official report, they had to bring in a drill machine just to crack it open. The post-mortem revealed he'd been murdered more than 2 weeks earlier, and the killers had tried to destroy his skin with wet cement. His teeth were loose, his skin was peeling, and the sheer level of decay was unlike anything the chief medical officer had seen in over 30 years. But perhaps the most haunting part, it wasn't a detective who broke the case wide open. It was Sorab's own 6-year-old daughter, who reportedly whispered to a neighbor, "Papa is in the drum. Let that settle in your bones." Story 2. It was yesterday. Nobody needed to die like that. It's just awful, what all has happened to this little town. On a September night in 2009, a family of 6 settled in for what they thought would be a peaceful evening. The children were tucked into bed and good nights were exchanged, but for this family, the sunrise would never come. A man with sinister motives broke into their home, and what followed was nothing short of a brutal massacre. The bloodshed was so extreme, so horrific, that it would forever be known as the bloodbath in Beeson. Even the seasoned investigators were left shaken by the carnage they found. And soon you'll understand why. This story brings us to Beeson, a tiny town about 200 miles from Chicago, tucked away in the heart of Illinois. Beeson has a population of just around 200 people, making it feel like a quiet, forgotten spot surrounded by farmland and rolling hills. And at the center of our story are 2 families, the G family and the Constant family, both of whom called Beeson their home in the late 1990s. Now let's get to know Rick G first. He was known for his strong work ethic and never-give-up attitude. Early in his career, he worked for his stepfather's construction company in Lincoln, Illinois, the nearest town with all the essentials. Schools, Walmart, restaurants, and even a small airport. It was the go-to place for people from the smaller towns when they needed to get stuff done. Rick's stepdad Pudge and his mom, Judy, lived in Lincoln too. For years, Rick hustled hard, picking up construction gigs wherever he could, and saving every penny to build a better future for himself and his daughter, Nicole G. His dedication finally paid off when he bought property on the edge of Beeson. And instead of sticking with his stepdad's company, he started his own business, which he called G Construction. He snagged a ranch-style home with a 2-car detached garage, an above-ground pool, and plenty of farmland for keeping chickens and other animals. But owning a business came with its costs, so Rick decided to rent out a room in his home. That's when Ruth Constant entered the scene, moving in with her 2 little kids, 3-year-old Justina and 1-year-old Dylan Constant. Initially, Ruth became Rick's tenant, but it didn't take long for sparks to fly between them. Ruth was a warm-hearted woman, known for her outgoing personality and sense of humor, and Rick was the perfect match for her. As their bond grew stronger, Ruth discovered she was pregnant. In 1997, they tied the knot, with Rick at 34 and Ruth at 27. Not long after, they welcomed a baby boy Austin, and their home was bustling with life. A year later, they celebrated the arrival of a baby girl, Jessica G., filling their hearts with more joy. Unfortunately, that joy was short-lived as they learned that little Jessica was born with a serious neurological condition, leaving her with disabilities that required around-the-clock care. With no facilities in Beeson that could meet Jessica's needs, and unable to afford the necessary care, they reluctantly had to move her 50 miles away to Peoria, Illinois, where she became a temporary ward of the state. It was reported that she died well before the tragic murder occurred. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day. Going back to the story, Dylan was also showing signs of trouble. According to their relatives, he was full of energy and often acted out, which is typical for kids his age. His teachers frequently sent home behavior reports, and Rick and Ruth worked hard to find ways to help. Eventually, he was diagnosed with ADHD after they decided to seek therapy for him. While the therapy helped a little, it didn't make a significant difference. However, there was a glimmer of hope when Rick's daughter, Nicole, turned 18 and started dating Christopher Harris, a 21-year-old local. Their relationship grew serious quickly, and they married, moving just a minute away from Rick's house. Not long after, Nicole discovered she was pregnant, making Ruth and Rick grandparents for the first time with the arrival of little Elisa Harris. They were thrilled, and Nicole and Chris often dropped Elisa off with Ruth while they worked. And in late July 2009, Nicole and Chris welcomed their second baby. To everyone who knew them, they seemed like the perfect family. With a new baby expected to start crawling soon, Rick's stepdad, Pudge, and his grandson Adam decided to help Nicole by putting in new carpet in her home that September. The following day, 10-year-old Seton Landstrom ran over to the G's house to show off his new bike. But when he reached the porch, he froze at the sight of blood smeared all over the porch and the door slightly open. Worried, he dashed to Nicole's house where Rick's stepdad had spent the night. As soon as they heard the boy's discovery, they immediately went to the house, and Adam was the first to reach the porch and notice the blood, as well as a knife at the bottom of the porch steps. When Adam entered the door and turned the lights on, he saw a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Lying in the hallway was Rick, face down in a thick pool of blood. Frozen in shock, Adam dared not to move further. He turned and ran outside to Pudge, telling him to call 911, though he didn't know what to tell the police since he hadn't seen it all firsthand. And when the police arrived, they were met with a huge pool of blood, around 2 to 3 feet wide. As they moved deeper into the house, they saw that Rick's head was completely wrecked, and his body looked like it had been through hell. At first, they couldn't tell how he died, but the gruesome scene made them suspect a shotgun was used. They hadn't even checked the other rooms yet. As they walked down the hallway, they noticed the walls were all messed up, like someone had punched or smashed them. Then they found the second victim, 14-year-old Dylan, curled up on the floor just outside the main bedroom, wearing nothing but shorts. His body was badly hurt, and his head was just as wrecked as Rick's. Blood splattered everywhere, even on the ceiling, making the officers feel uneasy as they continued through the house. When they stepped into the main bedroom, they saw Ruth lying on the floor in her nightgown. Half of her skull had caved in, and again blood was splattered all over the walls. Pushing on, they entered the attached bathroom, where they found 11-year-old Austin, dressed only in his underwear, lying face down on the bloody tile floor. It was clear that the G family never saw this evil coming. They must have been caught off guard getting ready for bed the night before. The officers moved cautiously through the house, unsure if the killer was still inside. They walked down that bloody hallway past Dylan's lifeless body and headed to 16-year-old Justina's room. And when they entered the room, they found something far more gruesome than what was initially found in the house. Blood smeared across every surface, soaking into her bed, where Justina lay on her stomach, her head hanging over the edge, leaving a puddle of brain matter below. She had suffered the worst injuries of anyone in the family. And just when they thought it couldn't get worse, they braced themselves for what came next. As they left Justina's room, they checked an adjacent space and initially saw no more victims. But then they spotted something in the dark closet. There, they found a 3-year-old girl's body crumpled on the floor, surrounded by blood, with skin peeled back above her right ear. It broke the officers' hearts. They were trained professionals, but nothing could prepare them for such a brutal scene, especially involving such a young child, beaten to death. Suddenly, a corporal noticed something move. It was the child. A paramedic rushed over and scooped her up like a baby, dashing out to the ambulance. They quickly ushered Nicole into the ambulance too, and off they sped toward the nearest hospital. But when they arrived, they discovered that Tabitha's vital signs were alarming. Moments later, Nicole's husband Chris showed up at the G's house. He had been called from work about the terrible incident. When he arrived, the police confirmed the heartbreaking truth. The family had been murdered, but in the middle of all the chaos and tragedy, there was hope. The police told Chris that Tabitha had survived. Everyone felt a wave of relief, because despite the horrific events, Tabitha was alive and might be able to help uncover who was behind this terrible crime. But not for Chris. He felt nervous when he learned Tabitha was alive. Without thinking twice, Chris jumped back in his truck and drove urgently toward the trauma center where Tabitha was being rushed. Meanwhile, two first responders, Logan County Sheriff's Corporal Michael Block and Illinois State Trooper Paul Hennessy, were left to sift through the crime scene for clues about what had happened inside the G family's home. Investigators found a bloody handprint on the bathroom vanity where Austin was killed, along with a fresh shoe print outside that matched a K-Swiss tennis shoe. Officers canvassed the small community and followed up on tips. One neighbor reported seeing a silver pickup truck passing by around the time of the murders, noting it had exhaust pipes coming up through the bed behind the cab. Despite these leads, police found no further clues. Dr. John Ralston, a forensic pathologist, performed the autopsies that night. He photographed every inch of the victims' bodies, but the injuries were so numerous that it was hard to keep track of them. But one thing was clear. They had been brutally attacked, and it wasn't from a gun. Initially thought to be caused by a shotgun, it turned out that each member of the G family had been bludgeoned to death, suffering with each blow until they were too weak to fight back. Starting with Rick G., the father, he had 39 impact wounds, 13 of which were to his head. His wife, Ruth, suffered 28 blows all over her body, and her skull was crushed. Their 11-year-old son Austin had a caved-in skull and was struck at least 21 times. Signs showed he had been pushed against hard objects and someone had stomped on his feet. 14-year-old Dylan had over 100 wounds and was struck at least 52 times. 16-year-old Justina had at least 15 identifiable injuries and was missing the top part of her skull. Meanwhile, Tabitha was in a real fight for her life. Doctors quickly discovered she had multiple skull fractures and serious brain swelling. It was tough for her. She couldn't speak or see because of the swelling in her face. But there was a small silver lining. She could still move her arm, showing she had some strength left. To help her recover, the doctors made the difficult decision to remove a few small pieces of her skull. They hoped this would ease the pressure from the swelling and help her brain heal properly. It was a scary situation, but the medical team was doing everything they could to save her. Nicole remained by Tabitha's side throughout her recovery at the hospital. The atmosphere was tense with police officers standing vigil behind her hospital bed. They knew Tabitha was the only survivor of the horrific incident, and there was a real concern that the suspect might try to come after her. This made it all the more important for the authorities to keep a close watch on her. Additionally, Nicole did her best to help the authorities, sharing everything she could about her loved ones and what had happened. On the other hand, Chris was a constant source of support for Nicole during this incredibly tough time. He spent hours with her, trying to offer comfort and help her navigate the chaos surrounding them. However, things weren't simple between Chris and Nicole. Their relationship had been tumultuous, filled with ups and downs. They had broken up several times, but had only managed to patch things up again earlier that same year in 2009. Days passed, and the police found themselves at a standstill. Despite following every lead they could, like the details of the suspicious car and the fresh shoe prints, they still hadn't identified any official suspects. The G family had no known enemies. In fact, they were well liked in the neighborhood, known for their generosity and kindness. Many neighbors could vouch for their good nature, painting a picture of a family that was both wealthy and loving. In light of the recent events, the police took precautions and encouraged everyone in the community to secure their homes and stay alert. People just need to take the normal precautions that you would take, the practical measures of at night, lock your door, know where your children are at, and keep track of your week past. And the funeral for the G family was held on the 28th of that same month. It was a heartbreaking day, but among all the grief, Tabitha was still fighting for her life in the hospital. And while the community mourned, there was also a lingering fear because the killer was still out there, and no one knew when or if they might strike again. Then, in a random but significant twist of fate, a major break in the case came at the hospital where Tabitha was being treated. One officer, after finishing his shift and guarding Tabitha, shared an elevator ride with Chris Harris, who had just left Tabitha's room. The officer happened to glance down and noticed Chris's shoes, case with sneakers with an aggressive tread, just like the shoe print found outside the crime scene. The officer quickly informed detectives, which led to Chris being called in for questioning. They compared his shoe tread to the print found at the scene, but there was a slight discrepancy. The shoes were a half size too big. However, the detectives knew something was off, so they didn't stop there. They collected Christopher Harris's fingerprints and palm prints, sending them to the crime lab for further analysis. To prove his innocence, his brother, Jason Harris, stepped in to defend him, providing an alibi and claiming they had been together the entire time, far away from Beeson, where the murders occurred. Meanwhile, Nicole was furious at the mere suggestion that Christopher could be involved. She took to her MySpace page to defend him, writing in an emotional, though error-filled message, "This whole situation is such a mess and so unfair. Not only have my children lost 5 close family members, but now their daddy is being set up and taken away. This is too much to bear." Nicole continued, "There's solid evidence that all 6 victims fought for their lives, and Chris doesn't even have a scratch on him. He's been with us through everything. Now they've taken him too." Nicole wasn't the only one standing up for Chris. His stepmother, Debbie Harris, also spoke out to the media, saying their family believed in his innocence. Chris' father, Ed, was in tears during a phone call with Chris from jail. According to Debbie, Chris was shocked by his arrest and scared for his family's safety, telling his father, "Dad, I'm scared because I know the killers are still out there." He swore he didn't commit the murders. When police booked Chris, they photographed his entire body. Although he didn't have any injuries, they noticed a large blister on the palm of his right hand. Coincidentally, a tire iron was later found near a creek by Jason's house, where investigators were still searching for clues. On October 2nd, when they seized Chris' truck, they found it belonged to Jennifer Ernest, Jason's girlfriend and mother of his other children. Both Jennifer and her mother, Sarah Duncan, had provided alibis for Chris and Jason on the night of the murders, but as the investigation unfolded, those alibis were proven false, leading to their arrest for obstruction of justice. The police were able to discredit the alibis partly because Chris' palm print had been found at the scene. Additionally, a woman named Lori Cole, an armed security guard, came forward. She claimed that on the night of the murders, around 11:35 p.m., Chris and his brother Jason knocked on her door, asking if she wanted to party. Lori, who lived not far from the G family, recalled telling Chris she wasn't interested and needed to sleep for work. She noticed a Ford Ranger parked outside, similar to the one Chris and Jason were seen with earlier. Although she told them to leave, their behavior left her unsettled, as they seemed to have already been partying and didn't want the night to end. Another woman, Christy Moore, came forward during the investigation. She told investigators that she and Chris had been on-again, off-again lovers. She revealed that Chris had called her late on that same Sunday night, but she was busy with her kids and couldn't meet up for what she knew he wanted: sex. However, she agreed to see him after her children went to school the next morning. Arrived at her house in Clinton, just a 15-minute drive from Beeson, about 12 hours after the murders. They slept together, and Christy said Chris was acting completely normal. Afterward, Christy even took selfies of the two of them in bed. In the pictures, they were kissing and giving each other flirtatious looks, with Chris smiling in some of them. She told investigators that Chris had no visible injuries or marks on his body, and that nothing about him seemed unusual, except that she hadn't seen him in the past 2 months, likely because he had just had a baby with Nicole 2 months earlier. From the moment Chris was accused, he maintained his innocence, denying any involvement in the murders. However, when confronted with fingerprint evidence, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and got a lawyer. It seemed that Chris was content to let the legal process play out, but things took a sharp turn as the pressure began to mount on his brother Jason. Initially charged with obstruction of justice, Jason's charges were soon upgraded to 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder, the same as Chris's charges. Jason, now facing the possibility of life in prison, had a choice to make: stay silent and support his brother, or tell the truth and save himself. The survival instinct kicked in, and Jason began to talk. The story he told was chilling. According to Jason, the night had started with drugs and alcohol. He and Chris had been out partying hard, drinking and snorting cocaine. Eventually, they decided they needed a woman's company to keep the night going. They first tried to reach out to some ex-girlfriends, but both women turned them down. That should have been the end of the night, but under the influence of drugs and Chris's heightened libido, the brothers continued their search for female company, which tragically led them to the G family's home. Jason recounted that they had first tried to visit Lori Cole, the armed security guard who lived nearby. He waited in the truck while Chris approached Lori's door, but she turned him away. What happened next is where Jason's story became inconsistent. He gave 13 different versions of the events, but the one thing that remained constant was his claim that Chris killed the G family. Jason alleged that it was Chris's idea to go to the G residence with the intent of having sex with Justina G, the 16-year-old daughter of the family and Chris's sister-in-law. Chris had convinced himself that Justina had been flirting with him. Whether they planned for it to be consensual or not remains unclear, but Jason said Chris believed Justina was interested in him. He then said that he stayed in the truck while Chris approached the house. In some versions of the story, Chris was already armed with a tire iron. In others, he went to the door without it. In one account, Rick G., the father, answered the door, and after a brief conversation, things escalated, leading Chris to retrieve the tire iron from the truck. Jason said he then heard screams and thumping sounds coming from inside the house, the horrifying beginning of what would turn into a gruesome massacre. Jason said he stayed in the pickup truck the whole time, just listening to the chaos inside the house. He heard loud thumps and screams, and saw Dylan jump out of a bedroom window. After that, Dylan ran to the front door and went back inside. Next thing Jason knew, Dylan burst out of the house, bleeding a lot, with Christopher Harris right behind him. Jason saw Chris hit Dylan 5 or 6 times with a tire iron before heading back inside. Miraculously, Dylan got back on his feet and went into the A few minutes later. Chris came out and hopped into the pickup. As they drove down the dirt road, he tossed his shoes and the tire iron out the window like it was no big deal. It's important to note that there had been a complaint of attempted sexual assault against Christopher Harris involving Justina, but this complaint was dropped just a week before the incident. Jason suggested that Christopher had intended to go to the G house for sexual motives, which ultimately did not happen. Investigators retraced the path that Jason Harris had described during his testimony. They found the case with shoes and the tire iron thrown into a ditch beside the road. Forensic tests confirmed that the DNA found on these items matched both Christopher Harris and the G family. On May 31, 2013, a jury found Christopher Harris guilty of murdering the G family. His sentencing happened on July 19, 2013, where he received 5 consecutive life sentences. In addition, he was sentenced to 30 years for the attempted murder of Tabitha, 30 years for home invasion, and 20 years for robbery. Christopher Harris's defense team tried to argue that he had walked in on Dylan during the murders and acted in self-defense when he killed Dylan. However, this argument was quickly dismissed. In 2013, just before his sentencing, Christopher and his legal team sought a retrial, but their request was denied. Later, in 2019, they filed an appeal with the Appellate Court of Illinois, 4th District, but that too was denied. If you think the story ends here, well, not quite. A former cellmate of Chris stepped forward, claiming that Chris had confided in him about the terrible events of that night. This cellmate revealed a story even darker than what Jason had shared. According to him, when Chris arrived at the G home, Rick answered the door. An argument broke out, escalating quickly when Chris hit Rick with the tire iron. Ruth heard the commotion and rushed in to see what was going on. Sadly, as she entered the room, Chris turned his violent rage on her. In the midst of the chaos, Dylan grabbed a kitchen knife, trying to protect his mother. But Chris was too strong, and it was during this intense moment that Jason saw Dylan crash through the window for the first time. In a chilling twist, the cellmate reported that Chris felt no remorse for his actions. In fact, he claimed his only regret was not burning down the house that night, suggesting that if he had, no one would ever know he was responsible for the violence. And let's not forget Nicole. With all the evidence piling up against Chris, she went from defending him to cursing him. Additionally, during the sentencing hearing, Tabitha also delivered an emotional statement that tugged at everyone's heartstrings. She said, "I am 7, and it still breaks my heart. I wish you were dead and my brothers, sister and mommy and daddy were alive. You don't sneak up on other people. You have to say sorry, because do you know how badly that broke my heart?" As for Jason, he got a 10-year sentence in exchange for testifying against Chris, with credit for time served. This decision sparked debate. Many questioned if it was fair for someone who played a part in such terrible acts. There were many times that night when Jason could have stepped in to help. He heard Dylan calling out for assistance, begging him to intervene. But he didn't act. However, his testimony helped bring justice for the G family. After the trial, Jason's girlfriend, Jennifer, and her mother faced probation and fines for hiding evidence. Meanwhile, little Tabitha, who was protected by state troopers during her hospital stay, formed a special bond with them. They painted her toenails, read her stories, and played games, showering her with the love and care she needed. They even threw her birthday party. Despite going through many surgeries, Tabitha made a remarkable recovery, and fortunately, the head injuries she suffered allowed her to forget the horrific events that took her family away. Tabitha spent some time in foster care, but eventually found a loving home with her sister, Nicole. As the community mourned and tried to heal from this tragic loss, they dedicated a playground in memory of Austin, Dylan, and Justina, creating a space where their spirits could be honored and celebrated. In an interesting twist, in 2014, the show When Murder Comes to Town aired, trying to shed light on the G family murders. Despite interviewing various residents and officers involved in the case, the show leaned heavily on the defense's narrative, suggesting that Dylan was a deeply troubled boy capable of violence. This portrayal sparked outrage among those who had worked on the case. The officers involved wrote an open letter questioning the show's accuracy, particularly how Dylan was portrayed. They emphasized his heroism, stating he wasn't just a victim, but a brave teen who tried to protect his family. Story 3. Now to a Wisconsin teenager accused of killing his parents to fund an alleged plot to kill President Trump. Yes, you heard it right. This teen would go on to kill his parents, slept with them for days, and later on planned to kill President Trump, all because of one twisted mindset of being a white supremacist. But before all of that, who is this teen really? And how does someone go from being an outstanding student to planning something so horrifying? What's it like to hear that about your neighbor? It's terrible. I was just so torn by it. His name was Nikita Kasap, though most people just called him Nicky. He was only 17 years old, a high school student living in the quiet suburbs of Waukesha, Wisconsin, a place where neighbors waved good morning and families walked their dogs after dinner. On the surface, his life seemed almost picture perfect. He lived with his mother, Tatiana Kasap, and his stepfather, Donald Meyer, in a spacious 4-bedroom house on Cider Hills Drive. It was a beautiful home, 3,000 square feet of calm, suburban comfort, complete with a loyal family dog named Toby. People who knew Nicky said he was quiet, maybe a little introverted, but polite and respectful. He was even named Student of the Month at his school, the Waukesha U.S. Health Department High School. His attendance was flawless. His grades were solid. There was no warning sign, at least none that stood out, until he stopped showing up. Nicky's last day at school was February 12, 2025. At first, no one thought much of it. Kids get sick. Families go on sudden trips. But as the days passed, concern grew. Weeks went by, and still no sign of Nicky or his parents. The school received one email claiming Nicky was sick, but something about it fell off. The email couldn't be verified. Then things got even stranger. On the morning of February 28th, Judith Meyer, Donald's mother, called in for a welfare check. She hadn't heard from her son in weeks, and she was worried. Around the same time, a school resource officer at Nicky's high school also contacted police. That made 2 separate welfare check requests in just 5 minutes, so it was enough for the Waukesha police to act. Now, officers arrived at the house on Cider Hills Drive at approximately 10 to 11 that morning. They knocked on the door, but no answer. They walked the perimeter, and still nothing. So they turned to the area's automated license plate recognition system, cameras that scan and record vehicle activity. What they found raised even more questions. Donald's black 2018 Volkswagen Atlas Cross Sport hadn't been seen since February 23rd. Tatiana's white 2019 BMW, last seen way back on February 11th, the very same day Nicky stopped going to school. Because of this discovery, alarm bells were now fully ringing. Police then contacted Donald's employer. His manager told them that Donald had been texting and sick between February 13th and February 25th, claiming he wasn't well enough to speak on the phone. He said he'd be back at work by March 3rd, but the manager noted something chilling. Those messages were completely out of character. Donald was reliable and communicative. So for him to go completely dark like that was bizarre and deeply troubling. At 1:52 in the afternoon, after hours of silence and unanswered questions, police forced entry into the home. What they discovered was every officer's nightmare. The moment they stepped inside, the unmistakable odor of human decomposition hit them. In the hallway near the kitchen, hidden under a pile of blankets and clothes, was the body of Tatiana Kasap. She had been shot 3 times. Twice in the stomach, once in the neck. She was just 35 years old. Officers immediately exited the scene to obtain a search warrant. When they re-entered at 5 o'clock that evening, they found Donald Meyer's body in the first-floor office. A single bullet wound to the back of the head. Execution style. He was 51. But Nikki, 17-year-old Nikki, and the family dog Toby were gone. Now it's safe to say that the house was a mess. Furniture was displaced. Artwork had been taken off the walls. Drawers and closets had been rifled through, their contents scattered everywhere. The mattress from the master bedroom had been removed from its frame. Empty bank envelopes were found in the kitchen. Something had clearly happened here, and whoever did it had taken their time. With the parents dead and the son missing, investigators turned to surveillance and cell phone data, and what they discovered painted a haunting timeline. Nicky hadn't just fled. He had stayed in that house, lived in that house, for 12 full days with the bodies of his murdered parents before finally leaving town in his stepfather's Volkswagen. He then traveled through 6 states: Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, and Kansas. At 11:25 p.m. on February 28th, the same day his parents were found, Nicky was located in Winfield, Kansas, more than 800 miles away from Waukesha. He was arrested during a traffic stop, and what police found inside the vehicle left no doubt in their minds. On the floorboard of the car was a loaded Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum revolver. It matched the description of a firearm recently purchased by Donald Meyer. Also found were rounds of ammunition, over 70 pieces of jewelry, multiple tablets for cell phones, 3 laptops, a safe that had been forcibly opened, and more than $14,000 in cash. There were also credit cards and driver's licenses belonging to his parents. And Toby, the family dog, was found alive in the car. After piecing together the evidence, authorities concluded that Tatiana and Donald had most likely been killed on February 11th, 17 days before their bodies were discovered. Nicky had lived with the bodies for nearly 2 weeks before taking off with their car, cash, valuables, and even the dog. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, 2 counts of hiding a corpse, 2 counts of theft, operating a motor vehicle without the owner's consent, and 2 counts of identity theft. Now here's where it gets even more chilling. This wasn't just a sudden outburst or a fight gone wrong. Prosecutors believed Nikita had been planning the murders for months, and he wasn't planning alone. According to court documents and testimony, Nikita had been messaging with someone in Russian through the app Telegram, a platform often used by extremists because it's encrypted and harder to trace. One of his classmates, only identified as Witness A, told authorities that Nikita said he had been talking to a man on Telegram and that the 2 of them were working together to overthrow the U.S. government. Nikita even said they had plans to assassinate President Donald Trump. That's not just disturbing, it's terrifying. Now, when Nikita was arrested, we mentioned earlier that the police found valuable items in his car that pointed directly to him being the killer. However, there was one item that stood out above all the rest, an unassuming memory card. At first, it seemed like just another ordinary piece of evidence, but what was on it would send shockwaves through everyone involved in the case. On this memory card, investigators discovered images and videos that were nothing short of disturbing. These weren't just random shots, these were chilling recordings that showed Nikita actively documenting his crime. According to the criminal complaint, one of the most haunting videos captured Nikita adjusting a camera and then pointing it directly at the dead body of his stepfather, Don Meyer. This was no accident. Nikita knew exactly what he was doing. What makes this even more sinister is what happened next. In the video, Nikita can be seen lighting candles around his stepfather's body. Why would he do that? Some believe he was trying to mask the awful smell of decomposition, but others suggest that this act wasn't just about hiding a smell. It was an eerie, almost ritualistic gesture. It's as if he was creating a scene, setting a stage for someone to witness his crime. But it doesn't stop there. The videos go further, showing Nikita allegedly pointing his phone at the body and speaking to someone on the other end of the line. This person remains unidentified, but in the video you can hear Nikita saying, so you can see him there. I can literally see the body there. It's chilling. He wasn't just filming for his own satisfaction. He was showing someone else. Investigators believe this person could be the same man Nikita had been messaging on Telegram, discussing far more disturbing topics. According to reports, These messages involve plans to take down the US government. A thought that's as disturbing as it is confusing. Now let's take a step back and look at Nikita's background. His story is not just one of a troubled teen. It's one of obsession and darkness. Nikita moved to the United States from Moldova at the age of 7. Moldova is a small country in Eastern Europe, right next to Ukraine, and it has strong Russian influences. But what's truly chilling is the fact that Nikita had very little family left in Moldova. His grandmother was the only relative still alive. Yet he developed an almost unhealthy obsession with Russia, fascism, and violence. This obsession became even clearer when his classmate, known as Witness A, came forward. According to her testimony, Nikita would send her horrific gore edits videos that mixed graphic and violent imagery with Russian music. These weren't just random videos. They were carefully crafted clips that reflected the twisted mindset Nikita had developed. She described how Nikita even added her on Snapchat and began pushing for a relationship, despite her clear lack of interest. But the creepiness didn't stop at unwanted attention. Nikita began talking about his desire to kill his parents. At first, he claimed it was just talk, something he didn't really mean. He reassured her in December of 2024 and again in January of 2025, but witnessed to consent something wasn't right. She even told Nikita that he seemed like a Nazi and a school shooter. She told him he needed help, but despite her concerns, it seems she didn't report any of this to the authorities. One of the most critical pieces of evidence came when police discovered a photo in January. It showed Nikita holding a Smith & Wesson handgun, the exact same weapon that investigators believe he used to kill his parents just a month later. This was not a coincidence. It wasn't until nearly a full month after his arrest that prosecutors officially filed murder charges against Nikita Kasap. By then, he had been caught in a small, rural Kansas county and had appeared virtually for an extradition hearing. The case moved forward in the District Court of Trigo County, Kansas, under the case named State versus Nikita Kasap. Later on, authorities extradited him back to Wisconsin, where he made his first court appearance on lesser charges. At that time, prosecutors had not yet officially filed murder charges, but they were already signaling that they were coming. Initially, he was charged with taking his stepfather's Smith & Wesson handgun and the family car without consent, both of which carried serious weight considering the violent aftermath. Then came the autopsy reports, which painted a horrifying picture. Don, his stepfather, had been executed with a single gunshot to the back of the head, likely from behind. His mother, Tatiana, suffered 3 gunshot wounds, one at close range to the neck and 2 others that were non-fatal. This detail suggested a chaotic and possibly prolonged encounter, raising more questions about motive, planning, and intent. It wasn't just a tragic event, it was a calculated act of violence. Still, in those early days, Nikita's bond was set at $250,000 as authorities worked to build the homicide case. 2 weeks later, the full weight of the law came crashing down. Prosecutors formally charged Nikita with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, the most severe criminal charges available under Wisconsin law, and 2 counts of hiding a corpse. These weren't just bureaucratic escalations, they were charges that, if proven, could send the 17-year-old to prison for life. Prosecutors declared him an extreme flight risk, citing his movements across state lines, his attempts to convert assets using a Bitcoin machine, and the $14,000 in cash and jewelry found on him at the time of his arrest. They believed he had the means and possibly the connections to evade justice, and they pushed for bail to be raised to $5 million. But Nikita's defense team wasn't backing down. They argued that the initial charges, taking a gun and a car, they couldn't even legally hold water since the items were taken from individuals who were already deceased, and thus couldn't have given or withheld consent. When it came to the murder charges, they insisted that a $5 million bail was excessive and unattainable for a 17-year-old. They claimed that the $250,000 bond should remain, framing Nikita as a troubled teen, not a calculated killer. At the bond hearing, the judge was visibly exasperated, not just by the nature of the case, but by the handling of the legal process. The judge wasn't just lamenting the bond debate. They were raising a broader question. When the system is faced with a suspect who allegedly murdered both parents, attempted to cover it up, and possibly plotted his escape, shouldn't the full legal framework be activated? The judge continued, highlighting the mountain of evidence laid out in the complaint. There's video evidence. There are communications, transactions, a witness. It's all here. If you believe he's a flight risk or a danger, don't just haggle over numbers. Use the mechanisms built into the law to keep the public safe. Despite the prosecution's push, the judge didn't grant the full $5 million bail. Still, it was clear the court recognized the gravity of the situation. The idea that a teenager had not only killed his parents, but lived in the same home with their decomposing bodies for 12 days, was profoundly disturbing. Authorities have linked Nicky to a neo-Nazi group called the Order of Nine Angles, and his manifesto allegedly called for a violent political revolution. As of the time this video was made, Nicky remains in custody with a bond set at $1 million. He faces multiple charges, including first-degree murder, and his trial is set to begin on May 7, 2025, where he will stand trial for 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide. A side investigation in Wisconsin takes a shocking turn. Federal documents link a teen accused of killing his parents to an assassination plot against President Trump. According to ABC News, investigators found a manifesto from 17-year-old Nikita Kasap with references to making bombs, a terrorist attack, and plans for the president's assassination. Authorities also found material linking the teen to a network of neo-Nazis. Investigators believe Kasap may have killed his parents to get the, quote, financial means and autonomy needed to pursue his plan. The teenager is charged with first-degree murder and is scheduled to be arraigned on May 7th. What makes this case truly chilling is not just the horror of the crime itself, but how a teenager, barely out of adolescence, could be so easily drawn into a world of extreme ideologies. One of the most unsettling pieces of evidence comes from a series of messages Nicky exchanged with a man on Telegram. In these messages, Nicky is shown toying with the idea of fleeing to Ukraine, wondering about the possibility of escaping the consequences of his actions. He even wrote, "So while in Ukraine, I'll be able to live a normal life even if when it's found out I did it." These words reveal a shocking level of detachment from the consequences of his actions. But even more disturbing is the way Nicky acknowledges that, no matter what, the world will eventually know he was the one responsible for the murders. What stands out in these exchanges is the disturbing fact that despite his delusions about fleeing to Ukraine, Nicky was very clear-headed about one thing. The truth would eventually catch up to him. He wasn't trying to hide from the fact that he would be caught. He was simply trying to escape the fallout. But what's even more unsettling is how Nicky didn't even try to frame anyone else for the murders. There was no attempt to pin the crime on his parents or anyone else in the family. He didn't go through the motions of creating a false alibi. Instead, he accepted that the blame for the killings would fall squarely on him. This chilling realization only makes his actions seem colder, more calculated. Now there are a lot of theories swirling around about whether Nicky's parents actually knew what he was planning, specifically his alleged desire to overthrow the U.S. government. Some believe they had suspicions, especially after receiving strange signals leading up to the murders. One particularly chilling detail comes from Donald Meyer's mother, Judith, who reportedly shared that her son had sent her some unsettling cryptic messages shortly before he went radio silent. These weren't your usual check-in texts. They hinted that something was wrong. But Judith didn't know just how serious it was at the time. So what if his parents did know something? What if they started to piece things together, noticed a shift in Nicky's behavior, sensed his growing obsession with radical ideologies, or even confronted him about his extremist beliefs? According to some theories, this might be exactly why Nicky targeted his parents first. To eliminate the only people who could stand in the way of whatever twisted plan he thought he was about to execute. Think about it. His parents knew where the money was hidden. They were the ones who gave him access to the house, the resources, even the revolver that was later used in the crime. Maybe Nicky believed that as long as they were alive, they were a threat to his vision. So he made a calculated decision to remove them from the equation, brutally and without remorse. Story 4. Love my boys so much. I wouldn't hurt them. This is the same mom who would later contradict herself in that interview. While most mothers would move mountains and part oceans for their kids, Tiffany Lucas did the exact opposite. However, it wasn't always this way. Back in her hometown, almost everyone believed she was a loving, devoted mother. That was her image, the mom who'd do anything for her boys. But as we've seen time and time again, appearances can lie. Because if she truly were that devoted, we wouldn't be talking about her right now on Into the Deep, the channel where we dive into the darkest and most disturbing crimes on Earth. And no, understanding what led up to this horror doesn't make it okay. But knowing what pushed her over the edge might help us spot red flags in others before it's too late. Because sometimes the signs are there, We just don't notice until tragedy strikes. Shepherdsville neighborhood is stunned tonight, now looking for the answers to a violent crime they never saw coming. Police say 2 young boys killed by their own mother. To possibly understand what pushed Tiffany Lucas to such a horrifying act, we need to look beyond the headlines and into her past. A life that, on the surface, seemed complicated but not deadly. At 32 years old, Tiffany and Lucas, originally from Chicago, Illinois, had 2 young sons, Jaden and Maurice. Both boys were under 10, each with a different father, and they attended Freedom Elementary School in Bullitt County. The small family lived together in a rented 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom home, a modest 1,400 square foot space that looked like any other suburban setup from the outside. Additionally, Tiffany had a very tight-knit bond with her father, John Lucas, and was raised alongside her brother. By all accounts, she was her dad's pride and joy, the classic daddy's girl. John saw her as someone special, and Tiffany clearly cherished that relationship. Her presence on social media painted a picture of someone juggling single motherhood with style. She posted tons of selfies, often dressed to impress, showing off her fashion sense and confidently flaunting her appearance. But beneath the curated photos and glam shots, there was one recurring theme that stood out: her love for her children. Time and time again, her posts showed joyful snapshots of her with Jaden and Maurice. Laughing, smiling, hugging. From the outside, it looked like she was doing her best to give her boys a happy life. But behind the filtered photos and heart emojis was a woman quietly struggling. Tiffany's early adult life was filled with big dreams and bigger obstacles. She first pursued modeling, which eventually gave way to a leap into entrepreneurship. In 2016, she launched Miss Tiff's One-Stop Shop, a convenience store offering food, tobacco, and odds and ends. It was a bold move, but sadly the business didn't last. By 2017, the shop had shuttered its doors. In a resurfaced interview, explained that she believed part of the failure was due to a Walmart location that was supposed to open nearby, but never did. After her business failed, things seemed to take a darker turn for Tiffany. At 2018, she found herself in trouble with the law. Arrested on drug possession charges, she later pleaded guilty and served a 30-day jail sentence. The court records didn't indicate any signs of violence or erratic behavior, just one misstep. In what had otherwise been a quiet legal history, and after that, there was silence. No more run-ins with the law. No major red flags. It seemed like Tiffany was turning a corner, keeping to herself, and trying to move forward. She reportedly took up a job that required overnight shifts, though the specifics of her employment remained unclear. For a while, it seemed like life was just rolling along, uneventfully. But as we know, life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. Because on January 1st, 2019, came the devastating event that may have marked the true breaking point for her. Her father, 47-year-old John Lucas, passed away suddenly. For Tiffany, it was as if the very ground beneath her feet had disappeared. Her father had been her rock, the person who gave her strength when she needed it, the one who offered advice, guidance, and unwavering support. His unexpected death left a gaping hole in her world, one that she couldn't fill with anything. In fact, Tiffany opened up about her loss in a deeply emotional Facebook video, where her raw grief was on full display. For her, the world had just become a much darker place, and no amount of smiling or posting photos could change that. Even though she tried to hold it together for the sake of her sons, something inside her had undeniably shifted. The grief was suffocating, and no amount of time could heal it the way she needed it to. Now, if you think the loss of her father was the main reason behind Tiffany's tragic actions, well, it's both true and not true. Her life continued down a dark and difficult path, filled with personal tragedies and heartbreaking struggles that just didn't seem to stop. The death of her father was a profound loss, but it wasn't the last in a series of devastating blows. Just 7 months after she buried her father, Tiffany was dealt another crushing blow. Daryl Howard, the father of one of her sons, was tragically murdered. At the time, she was still reeling from the loss of her dad, trying to figure out how to keep going, how to heal, and then this. Daryl's death added yet another layer of grief that she wasn't prepared for. The case is still an open homicide investigation by the Louisville Metro Police Department, and while the authorities keep searching for answers, Tiffany was left with more pain to bear. But that wasn't the end of it. Within a year, just when Tiffany could barely begin to process all the grief from these losses, she received yet another heartbreaking blow. Her mother, who had always been a part of her life, suffered a stroke, and was diagnosed with a brain tumor. Imagine the weight of these events, one after the other. Father, then the father of her child, and then her own mother's health, spiraling downward. It was as if everything she held close was slipping away, piece by piece. Amidst all these emotional and personal crises, Tiffany also found herself struggling financially. By the time of the tragic events of November 8th, things had become absolutely dire for her. The utilities in her home had been shut off, no electricity, no water, and on her kitchen counter, there was an eviction notice, a stark reminder of how precarious her situation had become. For someone like Tiffany, a young mother already bearing the weight of immense grief and stress, this notice wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a looming threat to her and her children's safety and stability. The possibility of losing her home likely triggered an avalanche of emotions. Fear about where she and her children would go, anxiety about how she would make ends meet and provide for them, and probably a deep sense of shame or guilt. The kind that comes when you're trying so hard to keep it all together, only to feel like you're falling short of the expectations society places on you as a mother. That constant pressure to create a secure environment, to make it all work, while everything around you crumbles, is unimaginable. And all of those struggles, those unbearable losses, relentless hardships and crushing fears, would tragically come to a head on November 8th of 2023. What unfolded that day was an unimaginable crime, one that shattered the peaceful facade of a quiet neighborhood and forever altered the lives of those involved. The crime took place in what seemed like an idyllic home nestled on Bentwood Drive in Shepherdsville, Kentucky, a place that on any other day could easily be mistaken for a scene from a Norman Rockwell painting, complete with its well-kept yard and the kind of serenity you'd expect from suburban life. But this was no peaceful scene. The horror that occurred in that home was so grotesque, so beyond comprehension, that a local deputy who arrived on the scene remarked that there was no way anyone could have survived what had happened, let alone two young boys, ages 9 and 6. I can tell you this, the boys were shot in an area that would not be survivable for anybody. However, they were alive to the best of our knowledge. When they were transported by EMS to the hospital and passed away while at the hospital. Before that day, it all started the evening of Tuesday, November 7th. A neighbor, just going about their evening, noticed Tiffany Lucas acting unusually agitated outside her home. She was scrubbing the carpets vigorously, her face drawn in a way that suggested something was terribly wrong. Concerned, the neighbor asked if she was okay, and Tiffany gave a vague response, saying only there's a lot going on. The unease in her words, though brief, didn't seem to match the image of a mother caring for her children in a safe home. Little did anyone know that was just the calm before the storm. The next day, the tranquility of a new morning was shattered. At approximately 11 in the morning, a horrifying cry for help shattered the peace of Bentwood Drive. Tiffany, visibly distressed and in utter despair, ran to a neighboring couple's house, shouting, "Help, my kids are dying." The panic in her voice could not be ignored. She collapsed on their driveway, overcome with emotion and fear. The couple's husband rushed into her home, hoping to find some clue, some explanation to what was happening. But what he discovered was beyond anything anyone could have imagined. In the living room, he found Tiffany's two young sons, both gravely injured and bleeding, yet somehow still alive. Their injuries were so severe, so clearly inflicted with brutal intent, that it seemed impossible for them to survive. Nearby, a gun lay on the floor, presumed to be the weapon used to carry out the unthinkable act. Time was running out, and the husband immediately called for help, urging emergency services to rush to the scene. The officers who arrived couldn't believe their eyes. The injuries inflicted on these two innocent children were so devastating, they were considered unsurvivable. The boys were rushed to Norton Children's Medical Center in Louisville, where emergency surgery was performed in a desperate bid to save their lives. But despite the best efforts of the medical staff, the boys succumbed to their injuries. In a matter of hours, two young lives had been taken in a way that no one could have ever anticipated. As the news began to spread, the shock of the tragedy left the citizens of Bullitt County stunned and in disbelief. How could this happen? How could a mother, someone who was supposed to protect and nurture her children, be responsible for such a horrific crime? Less than an hour after the boys were pronounced dead, Tiffany was arrested at the Bullitt County Emergency Medical Services facility. She was taken into custody, charged with the unthinkable, and held on a bond of $2 million. In a chilling bodycam video captured on the day of the murders, Tiffany appeared deeply distressed, far removed from the cheerful, put-together image she often shared on Facebook. Gone was the smiling mother posting filtered snapshots of family moments and hopeful captions. In her place stood a woman consumed by panic, grief, and something far darker. The footage was raw and haunting, a stark contrast to the carefully curated life she portrayed online. Now let's dive into the most asked and most haunting question of all. What really drove Tiffany to do it? Was it financial hardship? Could money, or the lack of it, truly push someone to commit something so unthinkable? On the surface, it might seem like a motive. Tiffany had been under tremendous pressure, juggling life as a single mom, dealing with custody battles, navigating failed relationships, and facing the day-to-day grind of simply trying to survive. But is that enough? Many mothers face similar or even greater hardships, yet they don't turn to violence. They find a way to fight, to protect, to endure. So for many following the case, the financial angle felt too shallow, too small a reason to explain such a monstrous act. And then came the chilling twist. In one of her interrogations, Tiffany claimed she was manipulated through Facebook into committing the horrific crime. This bizarre and unsettling statement emerged during a tense 3-hour interview with Detective Beale, who later testified in court. According to him, Tiffany offered no clear reasoning, only scattered thoughts. She reportedly called the shooting an accident and was full of remorse, muttering things like, "I'm so stupid and I'm in such a bad spot." But what really stood out were her attempts to distance herself from responsibility by claiming she was manipulated. According to reports from WDRB, Beale testified in court that Tiffany told him, "I would never do anything like this unless someone manipulated me." Specifically, she suggested that she had been manipulated through Facebook, Wi-Fi, and the internet, an eerie statement that raised even more questions about her mental state and the factors influencing her behavior. Tiffany's claim that she was manipulated through social media and technology left everyone confused. She didn't explain exactly what kind of manipulation she meant. Was it some kind of online conspiracy? Had she fallen down a dangerous rabbit hole, maybe influenced by groups like QAnon, which have pulled others into dark and destructive thinking? Or was it a sign of a deeper mental breakdown? Sadly, we've seen other cases where people influenced by toxic online communities have committed horrifying acts. So while it might sound far-fetched at first, the theory doesn't feel completely out of the question, especially when you consider what happened the day before. Everything fell apart. On November 7th of 2023, Ring doorbell footage from a neighbor's house showed Tiffany standing on their porch with her dog, Blue. What happened next was downright unsettling. She started going off on a strange emotional rant, saying things like she needed this neighbor to be an anchor in her life, and that she'd been talking to God. She repeatedly told her dog not to bark, insisting that this was her friend's house, and this is her house, as if she truly believed she belonged there. It was bizarre rambling, and left the neighbor understandably shaken. Later that same day, Tiffany was seen at a Waffle House with her 2 sons. The kids seemed happy, laughing and cracking jokes like any normal day, but Tiffany was completely disconnected. One server said she kept staring off into space, constantly looking over her shoulder, like she thought someone was following her. Another said she didn't speak a word to them, and that when she went to pay, her hands were shaking and she suddenly burst into tears. Looking back, some of the staff feel like she was silently reaching out for help, but they just didn't realize it at the time. Then came the next day, November 8th. That's when everything bubbling under the surface finally exploded. Neighbors called 911 after hearing gunshots coming from Tiffany's house. More Ring footage captured her at another neighbor's home, crying and pleading for help. When officers arrived, they found her lying face down in the driveway, sobbing and saying, "My sons are dying." Body cam footage shows an officer trying to help her sit up. She looked disoriented and kept saying, "I don't feel right," but didn't seem physically injured. After the tragedy, Tiffany was officially charged with 2 counts of capital murder. At first, she pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming that she had experienced a full-blown psychotic episode and genuinely believed she was protecting her sons from some kind of other being. According to her lawyer, Tiffany never imagined a life without her boys. In fact, he said she even tried to turn the weapon on herself after what she had done, but it jammed. He also argued that she had been detoxing from drugs, and this breakdown was a symptom of withdrawal. Now here's something that's both frustrating and mind-boggling. They didn't drug test her when she was booked into jail. How is that not standard procedure? You'd think it would be essential, especially for documentation purposes. But nope, nothing. Tiffany's trial was originally set for December of 2024, but she ended up changing her plea to guilty. And from what we can tell, there was no deal on the table. It looks like she just threw herself at the mercy of the court. It's possible she knew there was no way around a guilty verdict and decided to let the judge, not a jury, determine her fate, which could have helped avoid an even harsher outcome. During sentencing, both the prosecution and Tiffany's defense made their cases. Her lawyer continued to push the narrative that she was suffering from a psychotic disorder, and they played those disturbing clips again. The ones from the day before the tragedy, where she told a neighbor she needed help, and the footage from the Waffle House with her sons. It was meant to show her deteriorating mental state. 6 family members took the stand that day, delivering heart-wrenching victim impact statements. One of the most emotional came from Morris's father. He broke down in tears, talking about how Jaden was all he had left after losing one son already. And then Tiffany took Jaden too. He said he had begged Tiffany for custody of his son over and over again, especially due to her drug use, her lifestyle, the unsafe environment she was raising the boys in. He said he didn't just lose his child on November 8th. He felt like he'd lost him the day he was born, because from that moment on, he was constantly fighting for him. He'd called everyone, from his own family to hers, pleading for help, trying to get his son into a safer home. Despite the emotional testimonies, the judge handed down the sentence. 2 life sentences. The judge stated clearly that motherhood isn't just about giving life. It's about providing safety, love, and security. He said he couldn't even begin to imagine the terror those boys felt seeing their own mother holding a gun. Just the thought of the second child, hearing the shot that killed the first. It's unbearable. So she was sentenced to life in prison for both counts of murder. However, under Kentucky law, she'll technically be eligible for parole after serving 20 years. The family is understandably furious about that. The prosecution doesn't believe she'll ever be granted parole, but still, it's a possibility. One of the boys' aunts stood outside the courthouse and promised everyone that she'd be at every parole hearing, forever, making sure Tiffany never walks free. Before you ultimately took their life, part of this statement I was going to write, I hope every day you close your eyes that they haunt you, but I don't. You don't deserve to see them, and they shouldn't see you. If he decides to give you any kind of leniency today, and grant you parole at some point, bitch, I'll be there at every parole hearing. Do you hear me? I'll be there at every parole hearing. That same aunt pointed out how much support Tiffany actually had from the family, from her brother's girlfriend, from everyone. She was blunt, saying, you had a psychotic break because you did. She called out how people try to paint these stories with sympathy because of rough childhoods, but at the end of the day, Tiffany made the choice to take her son's lives. The aunt believes the only reason Tiffany chose to let the judge sentence her instead of a jury was to avoid even more time. She said she didn't deserve them, and now at least she can't hurt them anymore. Tiffany's defense team stuck to their narrative, insisting this all happened because she was trying to get clean from fentanyl and went psychotic. However, some observers questioned whether she was truly attempting to get clean, as she continued to post curated images of her children on social media just days before the incident, photos that painted a picture of a happy and stable home life. Given the nature of the crime and the circumstances surrounding the case, it is believed that Tiffany may face challenges during her time in prison. Factors such as the severity of her offense, the public attention surrounding the case, and how she presents herself may impact how she is treated by other inmates. This case has left a family shattered and a community grieving. Many are left reflecting on the signs that were missed and the efforts made by loved ones to intervene before it was too late. It serves as a stark reminder of how quickly situations can spiral when intervention fails, and of the deep, long-lasting pain left behind when children are lost in such a tragic way. Now I want to hear your thoughts. Story 5. It was the Christmas season of 1959 when the Walker family, a happy family of 4, went out to run some errands. Christine, the caring mother, decided to come home early to cook a warm dinner for her family while they were still out. But as soon as she stepped inside, she was met with an unknown intruder. This intruder went on to abuse Christine, and then shot her, leading to her tragic death. Moments later, her husband Cliff arrived home with their little ones, 3-year-old Jimmy, and 1-year-old Debbie. What should have been a joyful reunion quickly turned into a nightmare. Cliff was ambushed and shot without warning, leaving the innocent children defenseless. Jimmy was shot next, and it was reported that he crawled to his father as the killer fired bullet after bullet into his head. Little Debbie faced an even more horrific fate. After being shot, she was drowned in the family bathtub. This case remains unsolved to this day, but thanks to new technology, we might finally be getting closer to uncovering what really happened to the Walker family. Interestingly, this mystery is also linked to another well-known crime from the same year, a case that shaped the true crime genre as we know it. So if you're curious about who might be responsible for this horrific tragedy, let's dig in and find out more. The story of the Walker family begins in the quiet town of Osprey, located in Sarasota County, Florida. With a population of just over 6,000 people, Osprey was a small, peaceful place where everyone seemed to know each other. Cliff Walker and Christine first met at Arcadia High School, where their personalities couldn't have seemed more different yet fit together perfectly. Cliff was a tall, wiry cowboy known for his love of cool cigarettes. He rarely drank, but his friends could always count on him to be hardworking and dependable. Christine, on the other hand, was full of energy and charm. With her curly light brown hair and bright smile, she was the outgoing, flirty drum major who turned heads wherever she went. And despite having many admirers, Christine fell for Cliff, and the two quickly became inseparable. They married young, with Christine at 19 and Cliff at 20. In the 5 years that followed, their family grew, welcoming 2 children, Jimmy and Debbie, into their lives. Life was simple but joyful for the Walkers. They lived in a small whitewood frame house nestled at the end of a winding shell road on Potter Palmer Ranch, a massive property spanning over 14,000 acres. Cliff worked on the ranch as a cow handler, a tough but rewarding job. Their house was modest, but felt warm and welcoming, and the Walkers made it a loving home. The ranch was far from crowded, with their closest neighbors living a full mile away, giving them a quiet space to raise their little ones. Though Cliff made a steady income as a ranch hand, they weren't as financially comfortable as some of their friends and family. Money wasn't plentiful, but the Walkers valued the simple joys, quiet evenings, shared meals, and watching their 2 young children grow. Now life on the ranch meant early mornings for the Walker family. Most days, the home would already be stirring with activity at dawn, as Cliff would prepare for a long day's work, and Christine managed the busy mornings with the children. That's why, when a family friend named Don McLeod arrived at their house early on the morning of December 20th, 1959, he expected to find the Walkers up and about, maybe even getting ready for a busy day ahead. But instead, he was met with an unsettling silence. Thinking maybe Cliff had just overslept, knocked loudly on the back door. When no one answered, he tried again, each knock a little louder than the last. By the time he'd knocked several times with no response, worry began to set in. Finally feeling something was truly wrong, Don made a difficult choice to cut the screen door, unhook the latch, and enter the silent home. Stepping into the dark kitchen, he switched on the light, hoping he'd find a simple explanation for the strange stillness. But what Don saw next was beyond anything he could have imagined. Just inside the doorway to the living room, he spotted Christine's feet. She was barefoot, lying on the floor, her dress pulled up around her waist. Christine, just 24 years old, had been killed by a gunshot to the head, a wound inflicted by a .22 caliber weapon. As Don looked further into the room, his heart sank even more. Cliff was lying on his back, still wearing his cowboy hat. Next to him was their little son, 3-year-old Jimmy, lying close to his dad. Both had been shot in the head with the same weapon. The blood on the floor showed that Jimmy had crawled toward his father, possibly trying to seek comfort in his last moments. Debbie, the Walkers' 2-year-old daughter, was missing from where the rest of her family lay. Alarmed and horrified, he ran out of the house, jumped in his car, and drove a mile to the nearest payphone to call the police. Investigators arrived quickly, and as they searched the house, they made a heartbreaking discovery. Debbie was in the bathroom, lying in the bathtub. She had suffered a gunshot wound, but her actual cause of death was drowning. Now, when this tragic murder took place, the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office faced an uphill battle. They had no suspects to go on, so they combed through the house, searching for any clues that might reveal who was behind this horrific crime. However, the sheriff's office was small, underfunded, and didn't have enough resources to properly handle such a complex case. As a result, mistakes were made right from the start. Deputies from nearby counties came to help, bringing along bloodhounds, fingerprint experts, and ballistic specialists. Yet, despite this extra assistance, there were still major obstacles. Sarasota County didn't even have a camera to capture the scene. So news photographers had to be brought in to take crime scene photos, a crucial task usually reserved for investigators to prevent contamination. The presence of so many people coming, and going likely disturbed key evidence. For instance, any tire tracks from unfamiliar vehicles could have been destroyed by all the extra activity near the property. However, investigators did find some chilling details connected to the murder. It seemed that Christine was the attacker's first victim, and she put up a fierce fight. She had used her high-heeled shoe to defend herself, leaving traces of her attacker's blood on it. But even with her efforts, the intruder overpowered her, assaulted her, and took her life. Strangely, it looked as though her body had been moved and arranged in the living room afterward, almost as if staged by the killer. While combing through the scene, investigators also found unknown DNA evidence on Christine's clothing, a potential clue pointing to the attacker's identity, and fortunately enough, no similar signs of assault or struggle were found on the other family members. Additionally, several strange items were missing from the Walkers' home after the tragedy. Cliff's pocket knife, Christine's old high school majorette uniform, and even their marriage license. These weren't items a typical burglar would think to take, so police felt they could be clues. They also found disturbing signs left behind, and those are a bloody cowboy boot print on the floor, a partial fingerprint on the bathtub, some spent bullet casings believed to be from the murder weapon, and a cigarette wrapper of a brand no one in the Walker family smoked. In an odd twist, months after the murders, 3 local women stumbled across a pile of bloody clothing in a nearby shed. Among the items were 2 shirts, a skirt, a blouse, pants, and a handkerchief, all belonging to Cliff and Christine. Investigators believed the killer had used these clothes to wipe off blood before leaving the scene. All these clues led detectives to believe that the killer might have been someone familiar to the Walkers. For one, Christine hadn't parked in her usual spot in the driveway that day, hinting that someone else might have already been there. Even more unsettling was that the family's 3 dogs hadn't barked at the intruder. These dogs usually barked at anyone unfamiliar, so their silence suggested that whoever came into the Walker home that day wasn't a stranger to them. And to really understand why Christine was the first victim, investigators interviewed friends and family, gathering details about the Walkers' last day on December 19, 1959. This was just 6 days before Christmas. So the family of 4 headed out around 4 in the afternoon to run a few errands. They picked up cigarettes, sodas, candy, and cattle feed. Christine drove home in the family's 1952 Plymouth, arriving about 30 minutes before Cliff and the kids, who came later in his Jeep. Cliff had been considering a trade for a 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air with a green and white two-tone finish, and it's possible he was out checking on cars that day. It's possible that's why he and Christine were separated, allowing her to get home just a bit before him. Christine barely had time to hang her purse and put away the groceries before she was ambushed. Police believe that Cliff and the children arrived while the killer was still there, catching them off guard, and that's why they became victims. One of the biggest challenges for the investigation was that there were simply too many suspects. Detectives interviewed an overwhelming 587 people, which made it hard to narrow down who, if anyone, had a real connection to the murders. And after diving deep into the investigation and examining all the suspects, we've put together a list of the most intriguing names without any particular order. Starting with Curtis McCall, at the time of these tragic events, Curtis was just 21 years old and had a past with Christine Walker. They had dated back in high school, and rumors suggested that they might have rekindled their relationship shortly before her death. This connection immediately made him a person of interest in the case. What stood out about Curtis was that he owned a .22 caliber pistol, the very same type of weapon used in the murders. Interestingly, locals also painted him as a troublemaker, describing him as a no-good sort of guy who was always stirring up trouble. And according to rumors, after the murders, Curtis's demeanor changed noticeably. He became extremely anxious and lost a lot of weight, leading many to wonder if the weight of his actions was starting to catch up with him. It's also important to point out that Curtis had a history of violence. In fact, he had been fired from his job as a dispatcher for the Florida Highway Patrol after an incident where he attacked a man during a traffic stop. His fellow officers had to step in to prevent the situation from escalating, and surprisingly, Curtis didn't even remember what had happened. The investigation led authorities to track Curtis down to the Sumner County Courthouse in Georgia, where he was working as a construction foreman at the time. During questioning, he claimed he and Christine were never involved romantically, but he did recall seeing her a few weeks before the murders. Christine and her husband Cliff had stopped by his place to ask about a horse he was selling. This detail seemed innocent enough, but it showed he was still connected to the couple. When questioned about his .22 caliber pistol, Curtis admitted he once owned one, but insisted that he had sold it to someone, although he couldn't recall who that was. This inconsistency raised more eyebrows among investigators, and to get to the bottom of things, he underwent a polygraph test to determine his honesty. Initially, he appeared nervous, which could suggest he had something to hide. However, in subsequent tests, he seemed more at ease, and the results indicated that he was telling the truth about most of his statements. But there was a catch. When asked if he withheld any information during the questioning, the polygraph results were less clear. It suggested that he might not have been entirely truthful about certain details, leaving investigators wondering what he might be hiding. And as of today, no one knew if Curtis was still alive or what had happened to him. Next is Wilbur Tooker. Tooker was a 65-year-old retired railroad worker who lived just a mile southwest of the Walkers. He was once a familiar face in their home, dropping by often to chat and share stories. But his visits took a troubling turn as his behavior became more inappropriate, creating tension and discomfort within the family. It was reported that Christine Walker found herself increasingly uneasy around Tooker. She confided in her mother about her fears, expressing how much she dreaded being near him. This was not just a passing concern. It was a deep-rooted fear that Tooker might cross boundaries that no one should ever cross. Several family members and friends later recalled incidents where Tooker had tried to kiss Christine, or even coax her into bed. His actions were persistent enough that Christine felt she had to tell her husband, Cliff, about them. So obviously, Cliff was furious when he heard what Tooker had been doing. He wanted to confront the older man and put an end to it. But Christine, worried about potential trouble, persuaded him to hold back. Even so, Cliff made it clear to Tooker that he was no longer welcome in their home, and warned him not to come around anymore. Unfortunately, that warning seemed to fall on deaf ears. In the aftermath of the Walker family's tragic fate, Tucker's behavior raised even more suspicions. His friend William Hosmer revealed that Tooker was angry with Christine after her death, constantly talking about her in a way that made others uncomfortable. This strange obsession only added to the unsettling nature of Tucker's character. He often visited the Walker home, claiming he was gathering evidence to protect himself, which only fueled the investigation into his actions. On the day of the murders, detectives retraced Tucker's movements. He had gone out to dinner with a friend from around 5 p.m. to 7 p.m., but there was a significant gap in his timeline between 4 p.m. and 5 p.m. Just when the Walkers were brutally murdered, Tooker had no solid alibi. After dinner, he showed up at Bradenton High School by 7:45 p.m. to play the violin with the school orchestra. Investigators spoke with his fellow musicians to see if they noticed anything strange about Tooker that evening, but no one could confirm any odd behavior. Sadly, Tooker passed away in March 1963, leaving behind a trail of questions and an unsettling feeling surrounding the Walker family's tragic fate. Then we have Albert Walker, who happened to be Cliff's cousin. From the very beginning, Albert's reaction to the tragic death of the Walker family raised eyebrows. At the funeral, he didn't just shed a few tears, he wailed loudly, almost as if he were putting on a performance. It got so intense that he fainted and had to be carried out of the service. This dramatic display left many family members feeling uneasy, leading them to suspect that Albert was simply faking his grief for attention. Some even told investigators that he was putting on a show to draw a focus to himself. Albert had a reputation for being wild, especially when he drank. Family members whispered that he secretly had feelings for Christine, which made his behavior all the more suspicious. After the funeral, his actions only added fuel to the fire of suspicion. Whenever anyone mentioned the crime, Albert would suddenly leave the room, refusing to engage in conversations about the tragedy that had befallen his family. Growing up, Albert and Cliff were close. In fact, Albert had even lived with the Walker family for a time after separating from the military, which made his sudden withdrawal from discussions about the murders seem all the more troubling. When investigators decided to question Albert, he cooperated fully, undergoing a polygraph test, which he passed. However, on the day the bodies were discovered, Albert claimed he had come to Osprey from Walshula to discuss a Christmas party that Cliff was supposedly planning. Investigators later learned this story was untrue, as Cliff had not planned any party and was actually going to Arcadia for the holidays. When Albert arrived in Osprey that day, he dropped off a friend at the Ohio bar before heading to a nearby gas station, where he approached two men. One of the men noticed that Albert's eyes were red and thought he looked like he had a rough night. Albert asked, "Do you know where Cliff Walker lives?" This question struck them as strange because Albert had lived at the Walker's house for months after leaving the military in 1958. His fellow officers had to step in to prevent the situation from escalating, and surprisingly, Curtis didn't even remember what had happened. The investigation led authorities to track Curtis down to the Sumner County Courthouse in Georgia, where he was working as a construction foreman at the time. During questioning, he claimed he and Christine were never involved romantically, but he did recall seeing her a few weeks before the murders. Christine and her husband Cliff had stopped by his place to ask about a horse he was selling. This detail seemed innocent enough, but it showed he was still connected to the couple. When questioned about his .22 caliber pistol, Curtis admitted he once owned one, but insisted that he had sold it to someone, although he couldn't recall who that was. This inconsistency raised more eyebrows among investigators, and to get to the bottom of things, he underwent a polygraph test to determine his honesty. Initially, he appeared nervous, which could suggest he had something to hide. However, in subsequent tests, he seemed more at ease, and the results indicated that he was telling the truth about most of his statements. But there was a catch. When asked if he withheld any information during the questioning, the polygraph results were less clear. It suggested that he might not have been entirely truthful about certain details, leaving investigators wondering what he might be hiding. And as of today, no one knew if Curtis was still alive or what had happened to him. Next is Wilbur Tooker. Tooker was a 65-year-old retired railroad worker who lived just a mile southwest of the Walkers. He was once a familiar face in their home, dropping by often to chat and share stories. But his visits took a troubling turn as his behavior became more inappropriate, creating tension and discomfort within the family. It was reported that Christine Walker found herself increasingly uneasy around Tooker. She confided in her mother about her fears, expressing how much she dreaded being near him. This was not just a passing concern. It was a deep-rooted fear that Tooker might cross boundaries that no one should ever cross. Several family members and friends later recalled incidents where Tooker had tried to kiss Christine, or even coax her into bed. His actions were persistent enough that Christine felt she had to tell her husband, Cliff, about them. So, obviously, Cliff was furious when he heard what Tooker had been doing. He wanted to confront the older man and put an end to it. But Christine, worried about potential trouble, persuaded him to hold back. Even so, Cliff made it clear to Tooker that he was no longer welcome in their home, and warned him not to come around anymore. Unfortunately, that warning seemed to fall on deaf ears. In the aftermath of the Walker family's tragic fate, Tucker's behavior raised even more suspicions. His friend William Hosmer revealed that Tooker was angry with Christine after her death, constantly talking about her in a way that made others uncomfortable. This strange obsession only added to the unsettling nature of Tucker's character. He often visited the Walker home, claiming he was gathering evidence to protect himself, which only fueled the investigation into his actions. On the day of the murders, detectives retraced Tucker's movements. He had gone out to dinner with a friend from around 5 p.m. to 7 p.m., but there was a significant gap in his timeline between 4 p.m. and 5 p.m. Just when the Walkers were brutally murdered, Tooker had no solid alibi. After dinner, he showed up at Bradenton High School by 7:45 p.m. to play the violin with the school orchestra. Investigators spoke with his fellow musicians to see if they noticed anything strange about Tooker that evening, but no one could confirm any odd behavior. Sadly, Tooker passed away in March 1963, leaving behind a trail of questions and an unsettling feeling surrounding the Walker family's tragic fate. Then we have Albert Walker, who happened to be Cliff's cousin. From the very beginning, Albert's reaction to the tragic death of the Walker family raised eyebrows. At the funeral, he didn't just shed a few tears, he wailed loudly, almost as if he were putting on a performance. It got so intense that he fainted and had to be carried out of the service. This dramatic display left many family members feeling uneasy, leading them to suspect that Albert was simply faking his grief for attention. Some even told investigators that he was putting on a show to draw focus to himself. Albert had a reputation for being wild, especially when he drank. Family members whispered that he secretly had feelings for Christine, which made his behavior all the more suspicious. After the funeral, his actions only added fuel to the fire of suspicion. Whenever anyone mentioned the crime, Albert would suddenly leave the room, refusing to engage in conversations about the tragedy that had befallen his family. Growing up, Albert and Cliff were close. In fact, Albert had even lived with the Walker family for a time after separating from the military, which made his sudden withdrawal from discussions about the murders seem all the more troubling. When investigators decided to question Albert, he cooperated fully, undergoing a polygraph test, which he passed. However, on the day the bodies were discovered, Albert claimed he had come to Osprey from Walshula to discuss a Christmas party that Cliff was supposedly planning. Investigators later learned this story was untrue, as Cliff had not planned any party and was actually going to Arcadia for the holidays. When Albert arrived in Osprey that day, he dropped off a friend at the Ohio bar before heading to a nearby gas station, where he approached two men. One of the men noticed that Albert's eyes were red and thought he looked like he had a rough night. Albert asked, "Do you know where Cliff Walker lives?" This question struck them as strange because Albert had lived at the Walkers' house for months after leaving the military in 1958. He was familiar with the area and had attended many family cookouts and gatherings. One of the men at the gas station eventually told Albert the heartbreaking news. The Walker family had been murdered. When Albert arrived at the Walker home, he acted as if he had just heard the news for the first time. He sobbed uncontrollably, leaning over the hood of Christine's parked car, burying his head in his arms. In September of 1962, investigators revisited their focus on Albert, tracking him down in Ridgely, Tennessee, where he was working as a migrant farm worker. They first spoke with Albert's 17-year-old girlfriend, Johnny Rainey, and her brother. They revealed that although Albert often talked about the rest of the Walker family, he had never mentioned Christine. Johnny said that Albert appeared visibly disturbed when he talked about Cliff, while her brother noted that Albert was crying like a baby as he spoke about Debbie, Cliff's daughter, being drowned in the bathtub. Albert had even told him that Jimmy, Cliff's son, didn't die immediately because he crawled up to his daddy and died. This detail raised eyebrows among investigators, as there were no reports mentioning Jimmy crawling, only that he had died huddled next to his father. Albert was questioned and hooked up to a polygraph machine, which he passed. However, in 1987, Lieutenant Max Skeens, polygraph expert for the sheriff's office, expressed doubts about the reliability of old polygraphs. He explained that technology had significantly improved since then, and training back in the day was often minimal. During a meeting about the Walker case, detectives brought in Ellis Denham, an expert who had dedicated much of his career to solving the case. They asked him who his top suspect had been before he retired in 1975. Without hesitation, Denham replied, "Albert Walker." After this revelation, detectives brought Albert to the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office and connected him to the latest polygraph machine. Once again, Albert passed the test, and Lieutenant Dario Valente, who was part of the investigation, concluded in his report that Albert Walker is not responsible for the Walker murders. He added that Albert had been extremely cooperative and appreciated the ongoing concern regarding the investigation. Despite passing the polygraph tests and maintaining his innocence, Valente noted that this wouldn't be the last time Albert would be questioned about the murders. 15 years from now, somebody is going to come along and probably do everything that we did all over again, Valente predicted. Next, we have Butch Dennison. A woman came forward to the police and claimed that Dennison had boasted about killing the Walkers. According to her, he said his father helped him cover it up by burying his cowboy boots, which allegedly had blood from the Walkers on them. Butch's father passed a polygraph exam. However, there is no indication that Butch was ever questioned in relation to the Walker murders. Then there's the meter reader, Stanley Mock. Stanley Mock left his Brinks Avenue home to read meters for the electric company. He exchanged pleasantries with some families whose homes were on his route and played golf in his spare time. But a troubled mind lurked behind his everyman exterior. Before the Walker murders, he enlisted the help of a psychiatrist to quash an uncontrollable urge to kill his wife and two small children. From the beginning of the Walker investigation, detectives were drawn to Stanley, eager to solve the case. They discovered he had also been linked to another mysterious crime that had occurred a few months earlier. A young University of Florida student named Chandler Stevens had been found dead in his apartment, tied up, tortured, and left for dead in a gruesome scene that became known as the Mummy Murder. As the detectives dug deeper, they learned that Stanley's meter route included the very apartment complex where Stevens had lived. The coincidences piled up when they found out he also read the meter for the Walker house. Yet, despite the unsettling connections, investigators never uncovered any concrete evidence to link him to either crime. In a recent interview, Mary Mock, Stanley's widow, revealed how her husband had been deeply affected by the Walker family's deaths. He had known the children and felt a special bond with them during his meter readings. The news of their brutal murder shattered him. When he saw it in the paper in 1959, just about killed him, she recalled, explaining how he would often wander the streets at night, overcome with grief. Following the murders, Stanley suffered a complete breakdown and underwent electroshock therapy. His fear of hurting his own family haunted him, leaving him anxious and shaken during his work. Though Mary never knew her husband had been considered a suspect in the Walker case, she firmly believed in his innocence. "I'm positive in my heart he could never do something like that," she said, defending the man she knew and loved. There are also reports suggesting that a man named Emmett Monroe Spencer confessed to the murders of the Walker family. However, Sarasota County Sheriff Ross Boyer quickly discredited Spencer's confession, labeling him a pathological liar. The sheriff revealed that Spencer's claims were not genuine. Instead, they appeared to be cleverly constructed from real murders he had read about in newspapers and true crime novels he enjoyed. In an intriguing twist, in 1994, a bartender from Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, reached out to the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office with a tip. She claimed that one of her customers had boasted about killing the Walker family. Unfortunately, this lead was never verified, and to this day the case remains open. However, perhaps the most infamous figures potentially connected to this tragedy are Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, the notorious duo involved in the Clutter family murders, which gained significant attention in Truman Capote's book, In Cold Blood. If you've read this gripping book, you might remember a part that connects to the Walker family, highlighting eerie similarities between the two cases. The Clutter family was brutally killed by Hickok and Smith in Holcomb, Kansas, in 1959, just 34 days before the Walker family met a similar fate. What ties these two cases together is that, after killing the Clutter family, Smith and Hickok escaped to Florida in a stolen car. They were spotted at least a dozen times between Tallahassee and Miami. The pair checked into a motel in Miami Beach, about 4 hours away from Osprey, and left the morning of the Walker murders. On that same day, they shopped at a department store in Sarasota, just a few miles from the Walker home. One witness noted that the taller man had a scratched face. The duo was arrested in Las Vegas, Nevada, on December 30th, 1959, for the Clutter murders, and they were executed by hanging on April 14th, 1965. Although a polygraph test seemed to clear them of the Walker murders, some experts argue that the machines from the early 60s were often unreliable. The sheriff's office acknowledged that Hickok and Smith were considered suspects as early as 1960. Records show that the Walkers were looking to buy a 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air, which matched the stolen car that Smith and Hickok were using in Florida. This raises the possibility that they entered the Walker home under the pretense of selling the car. In December 2012, investigators in Sarasota County announced plans to exhume the bodies of Smith and Hickok from Mount Muncie Cemetery. They hoped to extract mitochondrial DNA from the bones to compare with semen found at the Walker home. The bodies were exhumed and DNA was collected. Kansas authorities stated they would prioritize processing the DNA from active cases, which could take weeks or even months. By August 2013, the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office announced that they found no match between the DNA of either Perry Smith or Richard Hickok and the samples from the Walker murder. Only partial DNA was retrieved, possibly due to degradation or contamination over the years, leaving the outcome uncertain. Therefore, and Hickok remain the prime suspects. However, based on the stolen items, Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist, believes it's unlikely they were the killers and suspects that the murderer knew at least one member of the Walker family. With all that being said, it seems like a crazy coincidence that these two notorious family murders were in the exact same place at the same time. But then, if you consider the personal items that went missing, like the marriage certificate and Christine's drum uniform, it makes no sense for a stranger to want these items unless they were taken as trophies. Yet, they weren't found on Hickok and Smith when they were arrested. Story 6. In the early hours of November 15, 1959, two men quietly slipped into the Clutter home through an unlocked door, searching for a safe. When they found nothing, they woke Herb Clutter, the father, who sleepily handed over the little cash he had, claiming there was no more to find. The intruders then disturbed the rest of the family. Bonnie, Herb's wife, was tied up and gagged before being tucked into a bed upstairs. Their 16-year-old daughter, Nancy, also had her hands bound, but was left ungagged. Herb and his 15-year-old son, Kenyon, were dragged to the basement, where Kenyon was bound and gagged on a sofa. Herb was left helpless on a mattress on the floor. While one man continued to search upstairs for valuables, he found nothing and grew furious. He stormed back to the basement, convinced that Herb was hiding something. After a heated argument, he brutally slit Herb's throat and shot him in cold blood. They then turned on Kenyon, Nancy, and Bonnie, killing them one by one without a second thought. These killers even drove over 400 miles to carry out their twisted plan. But why? Did they know this family at all? This is the chilling case of the Clutter family murders, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why it remains one of the most infamous murder cases in history, the very case that started the true crime genre itself. For those who didn't know, the Clutter family murders are seen as the birth of the true crime genre, thanks to the famous book In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. Published in 1966, the book tells the shocking story of the 1959 murders that we are going to talk about today. Capote was so fascinated by the crime that he decided to travel to Kansas to learn more. And he didn't go alone. He brought his childhood friend, Harper Lee, the author of To Kill a Mockingbird. Together, they interviewed people, gathered details, and worked on the book for 6 years. When In Cold Blood finally came out, it was a huge success and is still one of the best-selling true crime books to this day, second only to Helter Skelter, which tells the story of the Manson family murders. Now, let's look at the heart of the story. Herbert William Clutter, born on May 24, 1911, was a respected and well-known figure in Holcomb, Kansas. He graduated from Kansas State University and was active in the First United Methodist Church. Holcomb was a tiny town with only 272 people. By the 1970 census, everyone knew each other, doors were rarely locked, and the town had a small dirt main street. Herbert Clutter was a successful farmer, owning River Valley Farm, which stretched over more than 620 acres. His hard work earned him a great reputation in the agricultural world, and he was quite wealthy. The Clutters lived in a beautiful 14-room house, built in 1948 for $40,000, which was a lot of money at the time. So with all that being said, Herbert Clutter was a wealthy man, but he never flaunted his money. He was married to Bonnie Clutter, and together they had 4 children, Eviana, Beverly, Nancy, and Kenyon. By 1959, the 2 older girls had moved out, leaving Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon in the family home. In the book, Truman Capote delves into Bonnie's mental health struggles. After the birth of her 4 children, she battled postnatal depression, which continued to affect her throughout her life. Capote also mentioned her physical ailments, including a displaced vertebrae in her spine. Doctors had suggested that an operation could relieve both her mental and physical issues. However, surviving family members argue that this portrayal doesn't do justice to Bonnie. She wasn't just a sick person. She adored being outdoors and loved hosting gatherings at their home. Described as a true lady, she was eagerly anticipating a big family Thanksgiving with relatives traveling from all over the country to celebrate. On the other hand, Nancy Clutter, born on January 2, 1943, was 16 years old at the time of her death. Like the rest of her family, she was well-liked and respected in Holcomb, where she had a wide circle of friends. Nancy attended church every week, enjoyed baking, and loved horseback riding. Her boyfriend, Bobby, remarked that she didn't have a mean bone in her body. Then there was Kenyon, who was a year and a half younger than Nancy, born on August 29, 1944. At just 15, Kenyon was full of energy, always on the move and ready to crack a joke. He was just beginning to step into adulthood when his life was tragically cut short. On the 15th of November, 1959, a sense of dread hung in the air. It was a Sunday, and 2 of Nancy's friends came over, as they did every week, to go to church together. This time, however, they knocked on the door but received no answer. The cars were still in the garage, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Yet there was an unsettling silence inside the house. After several attempts to call the home, they decided to check again. This time, they found the front door unlocked and stepped inside, calling for Nancy. The house was eerily quiet. Worried, they headed to Nancy's room, expecting to find her still asleep. Instead, they were met with a horrific sight. Nancy lay dead in her bed, blood splattered across the walls. The father of one of Nancy's friends was waiting outside the house, and decided to go in to call the police himself. Once inside, he noticed the phone receiver was off the hook and the phone lines had been cut. Realizing something was very wrong, he and his son drove to a nearby place to call the police and alert them about the situation at the Clutter home. When the police arrived, they were met with a horrifying scene. Herbert Clutter was found in the basement's furnace room, bound and gagged, with a shotgun wound to the front of his head and his throat slit. Kenyon, his son, was found in another basement room, also bound and gagged and shot in the same manner. Bonnie Clutter was discovered in her bedroom, similarly bound and shot in the side of her head. Nancy lay dead in her bed, bound but shot in the back of her head. The police noted that Nancy was the only victim shot from behind, suggesting she might not have seen her killer. Was it someone she knew? Someone who couldn't bear the thought of her looking at them as they took her life? The entire community was left in shock. The Clutter family was well respected and liked by everyone. No one had anything bad to say about them. It was puzzling why such a tragedy had occurred, as they had no enemies or conflicts. The small-town residents wondered if the murderer was someone they knew, perhaps even a friend or acquaintance. Fear spread like wildfire. Hardware stores quickly ran out of locks as people started locking their doors for the first time in their lives. We didn't know who did it or why. Everybody was on edge. It truly made a different community. There was fear for the first time. Going back, the police started their investigation as they meticulously photographed every room in the house and every victim, searching for fingerprints. They found a single footprint near Nancy's blood. It belonged to a pair of worn-out cat boots. Despite their thorough examination, the only items missing were a small portable radio and a pair of binoculars. It was strange. Those items didn't seem like a motive for such brutal murders. However, there was a possible motive. The day before the murders, Herbert had taken out a life insurance policy for $40,000, which would go directly to his two surviving daughters after his death. Were his daughters somehow involved in the tragic fate of their family? Upon closer investigation, the police discovered that the new life insurance policy wasn't the motive for the murders. It was just a terrible coincidence. Herbert had been working on this policy for many months, but he only signed it the very afternoon of the tragic event. The officers quickly realized that his surviving daughters couldn't possibly be involved. They were completely heartbroken. So to begin their inquiry, the police decided to talk to Nancy's boyfriend, Bobby Rupp. They stressed that he wasn't a suspect, they just wanted to ask him some questions. Bobby had spent the night at the Clutter home, leaving shortly after 10 p.m. He and Nancy had planned to go to a midnight movie on Saturday, but Herbert suggested they go to the Friday night showing instead. If they hadn't changed their plans, it's likely that Nancy would still be alive. Now, according to the family's relatives, Herbert had always been wary of Nancy's relationship with Bobby. While he thought Bobby was a nice and respectful young man, he felt Nancy was too young at just 16 to be so serious. She had been dating Bobby for 3 years, and Herbert believed she shouldn't put all her eggs in one basket, especially since their families had different beliefs. Nancy's family were Methodists, while Bobby's were Roman Catholics. Herbert even asked Nancy to take a step back from the relationship, but Bobby continued to visit. So, on that night, Bobby had left the house just hours before the tragic events unfolded, making him the last person to see the Clutter family alive. It was natural for the police to dig deeper into his background. After interviewing him and giving him a polygraph test, they confirmed that Bobby had nothing to do with the murders. He was just a 17-year-old boy deeply in love with Nancy. He was not capable of such violence. However, because he was the last person seen with the family, the community became suspicious of him, unfairly branding him as guilty. The pressure became so intense that Bobby had to switch high schools and move to another town to escape the judgment. The police also considered the idea that Herbert's business rivals might have been involved, but every lead they pursued turned out to be a dead end. It was baffling, a whole family murdered, and no clear motive. The police began to suspect that this might have been a random act of violence by someone looking to cause chaos. In response, the local newspaper offered a $1,000 reward for any information that could help catch the killers. Unfortunately, this just brought in a flood of useless tips. 250 leads came in, but all were dead ends. On the Wednesday after the tragic murders, the funeral for the Clutter family was held. Family members traveled from all over the country to pay their respects. Just imagine being one of the 2 oldest daughters at that funeral, facing the heartbreaking loss of your entire family. It's hard to fathom how painful that must have been. Amid this darkness, there was a small ray of hope. Beverly, the second daughter, was engaged to be married that December. Since the police had no idea why the murders happened, they advised Beverly to change her name now, rather than wait until her wedding. They didn't want the killer to potentially track her down if the motive was connected to the Clutter family. With her family gathered for the funeral, Beverly thought, Why not get married now? I'll have to change my name anyway. So she went ahead with her wedding, which was attended by family, friends, church members, and the whole community. It was described as a fairy tale wedding happening in the midst of such a nightmare. As time passed, the investigation started to go cold. There were no leads, no clues, and not even the usual small-town gossip you might expect in cases like this. The police had piles of photographs from the crime scene, but progress was slow. However, in one of those photographs, they discovered a crucial piece of evidence. They found a footprint in blood in the basement near Herbert's body. But upon closer inspection of the photographs, they noticed another footprint in the dust. One that wasn't visible to the naked eye, but showed up in the camera's light. This second print belonged to a different boot, suggesting that they were looking for two suspects instead of just one. While this didn't necessarily help the investigation further, since they still didn't know where to start, it at least provided some clarity. They now knew they were searching for two individuals. Then, just when it seemed like the case would remain unsolved, luck struck. 10 days after the murders, the police received a tip that someone had valuable information. That $1,000 reward from the local newspaper had caught the attention of an inmate at the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, Kansas. An FBI detective was sent to interview him. This inmate was 32-year-old Floyd Wells, who had worked for the Clutters 10 years earlier, in 1948 and 1949. Floyd Wells had a colorful life, trying his hand at many different jobs, but never really settling into one. He served as a soldier, worked as a ranch hand, and even took on mechanic roles. When he was just 19, he started working for the Clutter family on their farm, right as they were finishing up their beautiful new house. Floyd loved his time with the Clutters. They treated him like family. He recalled how Mr. Clutter surprised him with an extra $50 as a Christmas bonus, showing just how kind they were. After finishing his work with the Clutters in 1949, Floyd went through a series of ups and downs. He got married, then divorced, and even served in the Army. Fast forward 10 years to June 1959, and Floyd found himself in trouble. He was arrested for breaking into an electrical appliance store in an attempt to steal a lawnmower. He had dreams of starting a lawnmower rental business, but figured he needed the equipment first. Unfortunately, he got caught and ended up with a 5-year prison sentence. While in prison, Floyd's cellmate was a man named Richard Hickok, who he called Dick. Since they spent a lot of time together, they had plenty of conversations. One day, their talk shifted to past jobs, and Floyd shared stories about working for Mr. Clutter on his farm in western Kansas. Curious, Hickok asked Floyd if Mr. Clutter was wealthy. Floyd nodded and explained how he once saw Mr. Clutter pay a hefty lumber bill in cash from a safe inside his home. That week alone, he remembered Mr. Clutter spending around $10,000 on various bills. From then on, Hickok couldn't stop asking questions about the Clutter family. He wanted to know how many of them there were, their ages, and the layout of the house. He even inquired about where Mr. Clutter kept his safe. Floyd shared everything he knew, not realizing how dangerous this information would become. Before long, Hickok started talking about a sinister plan. He had to kill Mr. Clutter, going into detail about how he intended to carry it out. Hickok often mentioned a man named Perry Edward Smith, whom he had met while they were both in prison in Lansing. Although Smith had been released on parole, Hickok knew he could always count on him as a partner. The two men had a close bond, and some sources even speculate that they may have had a romantic relationship, but that remains uncertain after all these years. Hickok seemed to have a special attachment to Perry, and was eager to get him involved in his plan to target the Clutter family. Hickok vividly described to Floyd how he intended to carry out this crime, detailing plans to tie up the Clutters and shoot them. However, Floyd didn't take Hickok seriously. Life in prison often involved this kind of bravado, talking tough to intimidate other inmates or just to boast. So Floyd shrugged off Hickok's threats as mere prison chatter. That all changed one day while lying in his cell, listening to the news on the radio. He heard about the tragic murders of the Clutter family in western Kansas. Even then, Floyd remained silent. The fear of being labeled a snitch in prison was far too great. It could cost him his life. Despite this, he followed the news closely, especially when they announced a reward of $1,000 for information about the murders. The reward almost tempted him to speak up, but he hesitated. Along with the fear of being a snitch, he worried about being seen as an accomplice to murder. After all, he had unknowingly led the killers to the Clutters. Eventually, Floyd couldn't hold it in any longer. He confided in a fellow inmate, who who was religious and whom he trusted. This inmate offered to help Floyd get called into the warden's office without it looking suspicious. It would seem like Floyd was in trouble for something else, not for snitching. The next day he was summoned to the warden's office, and he finally told his story. 10 days later, the police had the answers they needed. They confirmed that Floyd Wells had indeed worked for the Clutter family 10 years earlier and gathered information about Perry Smith and Dick Hickok, complete with mugshots. Now they knew who they were searching for, but they still had no idea where to find them. Now to give you some context, Richard Eugene Dick Hickok was born in Kansas City to farm worker parents. As the firstborn son, he was a star athlete, excelling in baseball, basketball, and football. He had a happy childhood, got good grades, and graduated high school with plans to study engineering in college. Unfortunately, his family couldn't afford to send him, so he took a job with the Santa Fe Railway in Kansas City. At just 19, he married a 16-year-old named Carol. Together, they rented a house and bought a nice car, starting their life as a young couple. After his time working in various jobs, Dick started driving ambulances for the local hospital. He then transitioned to working as a mechanic and a car painter, showing promise for a bright future. However, everything changed one fateful day when he was involved in a serious car accident. His vehicle flipped over, crashing into the water by the side of the road, leaving him face down and unconscious. Thankfully, a passerby noticed and rushed to pull him out just before he drowned. The accident left Dick with a severe head injury that would alter his life forever. His face became slightly disfigured and his features became noticeably asymmetrical. His father noted that Dick was never the same after the accident. His personality shifted dramatically. He started engaging in petty crimes, gambling, writing bad checks, and even cheating on his wife Carol with an older mistress. Eventually, he left Carol for this mistress, despite having 3 children with her. As his criminal activities escalated, Dick began stealing firearms and attempting to sell them. His actions ultimately caught up with him, leading to his incarceration at Lansing Penitentiary, where he met Floyd Wells. On the other hand, Perry Edward Smith had a troubled upbringing. Born in Huntington, Nevada to rodeo-performing parents Tex and Flo, he had a mixed heritage. His father was Irish, and his mother was Cherokee Native American. Unlike Hickok, Perry's childhood was tumultuous. In 1929, his family moved to Alaska, where Tex began distilling bootleg whiskey for a living. Unfortunately, he was abusive towards his wife and children, causing Flo to leave with the kids to San Francisco. However, she struggled with alcoholism, and life didn't improve much for them there. Perry felt the impact of this unstable childhood deeply. At just 8 years old, he was arrested for the first time, marking the beginning of a troubled life. Tragically, Flo died in an alcoholic coma when Perry was 13, choking on her own vomit. This event led to Perry and his siblings being shuffled between various orphanages and institutions, where they faced physical and emotional abuse. Eventually, Perry reunited with his father, and they attempted to live together while moving around the western United States. Unfortunately, their relationship was rocky, and Perry, who was struggling himself, turned to petty crime to survive. Without an education, he found it difficult to make a life for himself. Perry joined the army and served in the Korean War. In 1952, he received an honorable discharge, despite spending time in the stockade for fighting. While stationed at Fort Lewis in Washington, he bought a motorcycle with his first paycheck, but was soon involved in a serious accident that left him hospitalized for 6 months. As a result, he suffered permanent leg disabilities and chronic pain, requiring him to rely on medication for the rest of his life. By 1956, Perry was convicted of grand larceny, jailbreak, and car theft, leading to his imprisonment at Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, where he formed a close bond with Dick Hickok. Perry was released from prison early in 1959, and shortly after, Hickok also gained his freedom in November of that same year. Right after being released from prison, Hickok wasted no time. He quickly reached out to Perry Smith, urging him to break his parole and return to Kansas to help with a robbery he had been plotting. In jail, Smith had claimed he had killed a man, a story that many found hard to believe, but it gained traction among inmates, including Hickok. Trusted Smith completely. Hickok was convinced that Smith would assist in committing these crimes, referring to this heist as his big score, and he believed Smith wouldn't hesitate to kill if necessary. Earlier that year, Smith had been paroled and briefly lived with his father in Reno. However, after a fallout, he found himself on the move and spent a month in Las Vegas. When he received Hickok's letter, he decided to return to Kansas City, hoping to reunite with another former inmate. Unfortunately, he missed the meeting by just a few hours. Once they reunited, Hickok laid out his robbery plan, and they got straight to work. On the night of November 14th, they entered the Clutter family home through an unlocked door. Their intention was to kill the family and steal cash from a safe. However, they were shocked to discover there was no safe at all, meaning they had killed the Clutter family for no reason whatsoever. After the murders, the pair headed to Kansas City, where Hickok briefly worked at a car paint shop. He stopped going to work after the 20th, and on the 21st, he tried to pass a bad check for $192 at the Elko camera shop. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation later spoke with Hickok's parents, who mentioned that Dick and Perry had taken a trip to Fort Scott, Kansas, on November 14th, allegedly to find one of Perry's sisters. They returned home for a quick lunch on November 15th, before heading to Kansas City. The KBI conducted a search of their home and found a bloody shirt in a drawer and a shotgun that Hickok had bought. While owning a shotgun was quite common in Kansas and didn't raise immediate red flags, the KBI believed they were on the right trail. After spending a short time in Kansas City and writing several bad checks, the duo decided to escape to Mexico. They reportedly pawned the radio and binoculars they had stolen from the Clutters, and even sold the car they had used to drive there. However, they eventually planned to return to the United States, intending to commit more crimes to earn enough money to escape to Brazil, where they thought they couldn't be extradited back to the U.S. They crossed back into the States 31 days after the murders, mailing most of their belongings to Las Vegas for later pickup. This was part of their strategy to travel light, so they could easily hitchhike across the country. After hitchhiking east and stealing a car in Iowa, Hickok and Perry Smith found themselves back in Kansas City. Hickok began passing a staggering number of bad checks, totaling over $500. On December 16th, authorities received a tip from a furniture store about bad checks being used to purchase a television set. The KBI raced to the scene, where employees identified Hickok from a photo. At the same time, a service station worker recognized him as he tried to use a bad check there, putting the authorities hot on their trail. From Kansas City, the pair drove down to Miami, Florida, where they spent Christmas. They sold everything they had bought with those bad checks in Miami, and continued their zigzag journey across the United States, picking up odd jobs here and there for cash. Around New Year's, they decided to return to Las Vegas, still driving the stolen car from Iowa. However, by the time they reached Vegas and picked up their belongings from the post office, the police had started to catch on to the car's dubious history. Finally, the police stopped them. When they searched the trunk of the car, they discovered 2 pairs of boots, one with a cat's paw sole and the other with diamond tread, matching the boot prints found at the Clutter murder scene. This crucial piece of evidence linked them directly to the murders. If the police had apprehended them just an hour earlier, they would have missed finding those boots, and this vital evidence could have slipped away. It was pure luck for law enforcement. The Kansas police traveled to Las Vegas to interview Hickok and Smith, focusing on Hickok, who was known to be more talkative. Smith, on the other hand, seemed detached and cold. Hickok was charming and chatty, so the police started by discussing the bad checks found in the Kansas City area before directly asking about the Clutter family murders. They informed Hickok that they had irrefutable evidence placing both men at the crime scene, making it impossible for them to deny involvement. Under pressure, Hickok began to talk. He asked if there was any way he could get out on a manslaughter charge, claiming, "I never pulled the trigger. In fact, I didn't know what the hell was going on. I was in the other room when it first happened." He shifted the blame for the murders onto Perry Smith, who remained silent and avoided the questions, denying any knowledge of the Clutter family murders while Hickok effectively confessed in the other room. Eventually, the 2 men were driven back to Kansas in separate cars, with Dick Hickok in the front vehicle and Perry Smith in the one behind. This arrangement was deliberate. Investigators knew Hickok couldn't stop talking. They figured if Smith saw Hickok chatting away with the investigators, he would likely get frustrated. And that's precisely what happened. As Smith simmered with anger, he began talking to the investigator in his car. He pointed out that they had agreed to stay silent if they were ever caught, but here was Hickok spilling his version of the story. Smith shared how he had received a letter from Dick, detailing their plan to stay at Dick's parents' house to put new tires on the car before heading to Holcomb the next morning. They had Dick's shotgun and a hunting jacket, stuffed with shells along with more ammunition in the trunk. During their trip, they stopped to buy cord, knowing they would need to tie up people. They bought all the cord available, enough to restrain about 12 to 14 individuals. They arrived at the Clutter home between midnight and 1 a.m. While scouting the area, they encountered Mr. Clutter and asked him where the safe was. Mr. Clutter insisted there was no safe and that he kept no money in the house. However, Dick was convinced Mr. Clutter was lying, although Smith believed him. Instructed by Hickok, Smith cut the phone lines and they went upstairs, waking up Bonnie first. She echoed her husband's earlier claim that there was no safe. They then woke Kenyon before finally getting to Nancy, who was already awake. In his account, Smith expressed his disgust at Hickok's attitude. He was shocked by how Hickok was behaving, having never seen him like that before. Smith believed the family when they insisted there was no safe, while Hickok refused to accept it. The two decided to separate the family members, tying them up one by one in different rooms of the house. Even after finding about $50 in change, they continued to press Mr. Clutter for money. He assured them that if he had any cash, he would have given it to them by now. Frustrated, Smith turned to Hickok and asked what now. Hickok coldly replied that they were to leave no witnesses behind. The two debated who would go first. Eventually, fueled by anger and frustration, Dick stabbed Mr. Clutter in the throat with his hunting knife. He then urged Hickok to do his part, and Hickok stabbed Mr. Clutter again in the same wound. Smith shot Mr. Clutter in the head, then turned the gun on Kenyon, and finally shot Nancy and Bonnie. While Hickok was right about Smith being capable of murder, there's considerable debate about the exact sequence of events. Both men had conflicting accounts regarding who killed the two women. Hickok testified that Smith murdered all 4 family members, while Smith initially confessed to killing the women, but later refused to sign his confession, stating he had shot them. Both men declined to testify in court, leading to a lack of official documentation on who was responsible for the murders. Their only defense during the trial centered around the claim of insanity. A psychiatrist was called in to assess both men. Hickok was found to be impulsive, possibly due to a prior head injury, and exhibited a notable lack of empathy. Surprisingly, he expressed some remorse, not for the murders themselves, but for getting caught. He even mentioned that he would be upset if someone harmed his own family. Hickok's troubling attraction to teenage girls is another aspect of his character. His first wife was only 16 when he was 19, and this pattern persisted as he got older. He later admitted that one of his main motives for targeting the Clutter home was not just robbery, but the desire to assault 16-year-old Nancy Clutter. Even when he realized there was no safe to steal from, he was still intent on committing his crime until Smith stepped in to stop him. For Smith, the thought of rape was a line he couldn't cross, even in the context of their violent plan. On the flip side, Perry Smith was genuinely curious about his own psyche and wanted to understand what made him tick. He acknowledged that there was something wrong with him for committing such terrible acts. The psychiatrist described him as paranoid and borderline delusional, reflecting a troubled mind. Smith had a difficult childhood that contributed to severe anger issues. Interestingly, when they arrived at the Clutter house, he initially wanted to turn back but ultimately lost control and ended up committing murder. The key question during their trial was whether they could distinguish right from wrong. The psychiatrist concluded that Hickok understood the difference. While he couldn't form a definitive opinion about Smith's mental state, both men were charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. On March 29, 1960, they were found guilty, and the jury recommended the death penalty. After spending 5 years on death row at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, they were executed by hanging on April 14, 1965. Hickok was pronounced dead at 12:41 a.m., followed by Smith at 1:19 a.m. The tragic murders of the Clutter family, carried out for a mere $50 worth of items, continue to leave a haunting impression on society. In a twist of fate, years later, both Hickok and Smith's bodies were exhumed from the cemetery as authorities aimed to solve a cold case that had lingered for 53 years. This involved the tragic murders of the Walker family. Cliff and Christine Walker, along with their 2 young children, 3-year-old Jimmy and 1-year-old Debbie. The entire family was shot to death in their home in Osprey, Florida on December 19, 1959. The KBI exhumed the bodies of Richard Hickok and Perry Smith. The 2 men were executed for the murders of Herb and Bonnie Clutter and their children in Holcomb, Kansas. At the time of the Walker murders, Hickok and Smith were known to be in Florida, spending Christmas not far from where this crime occurred. They were initially considered suspects, but a polygraph test cleared them of the murders. However, with modern standards for polygraph testing, those results would not hold up today. Authorities hoped that by exhuming the bodies, they could match DNA samples to semen found on Christine Walker, who had been raped by her murderer. By August 2014, it was announced that investigators had been unable to find a DNA match. Only partial DNA could be retrieved from the bones, and the samples taken from Christine were too old, degraded, and contaminated. Thus, Hickok and Smith remain at the forefront of suspicion in the Walker family case, even if they cannot be definitively ruled in or out. If you're interested, just let me know, and I can provide a complete overview of the Walker family tragedy.